Section 19, The French Revolution. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Section 19, The French Revolution by Hilaire Belloc. Chapter 4 continued, The Phases of the Revolution. Phase 6 continued. Parallel to this action on the part of the Committee was their sudden attack upon men of the other extreme, the men whose violence, excessive even for that time, threatened to provoke reaction. Herbert was the chief of these, the spokesman of the Commune of Paris, and he also perished. Meanwhile, the Committee had permitted other persecutions and other deaths, notably that of the Queen. A sane policy would have demanded that she should be kept a hostage. She was sacrificed to the desire for vengeance, and her head fell on the same day on which the decisive battle of Montigny was won. Later, the King's sister, Madame Elizabeth, was sacrificed to the same passions, and with her must be counted a certain proportion of the victims whose destruction could be no part of the Committee's scheme and proceeded purely from the motives of an ancient hatred. Though in the case of many of these who were of aristocratic birth or influence through their wealth, it is not easy to determine how far the possibility of their intrigue with the foreigner may not have led them to the scaffold. In the last 4 months of the period we are considering in this book, through April, that is, after the execution of Danton, through May and June, almost to the end of July, Robespierre appears with a particular prominence. Fads or doctrines of his own are admitted upon the statute book of the Revolution, notably his religious dogmas of a personal God and of the immortality of the soul. Nay, a public solemnity is arranged in honor of such matters, and he is the high priest therein. The intensity of the idolatry he received was never greater. The numbers that it shared were perhaps diminishing. It is certain that he did not appreciate how far the supports of his great popularity were failing. It is certain that he saw only the increasing enthusiasm of his immediate followers. The Committee still used him as their tool, notably for an increase in the Terror in June, but it is possible that for the first time in all these months he began to attempt some sort of authority within the Committee. We know, for instance, that he quarrelled with Carnot, who was easily the strongest man therein. In the past they had permitted him to indulge a private policy where it did not interfere with the general military plan. He was largely responsible, not through his own judgment, but from his desire to voice opinion, for the trial and execution of the Queen. He had temporized when Danton was beginning his campaign against the Terror at the end of 1793. It is an ineffaceable blot upon his memory and his justly earned reputation for integrity and sincerity that he first permitted and then helped towards Danton's execution. We may presume from the few indications we have that he protested against it in the secret councils of the Committee, but he had yielded, and what is more, since Saint Just desired to be Danton's accuser, he had furnished Saint Just with notes against Danton. Though it was the Committee who were morally responsible for the extreme extension of the Terror which proceeded during those last few months, Robespierre had the unwisdom to act as their instrument, to draft their last decrees, and believing the Terror to be popular, to support it in public. It was this that ruined him. The extreme terrorists, who were not yet satiated with vengeance, and who hated and feared a popular idol, determined to overthrow him. The mass of those who might be the next victims, and who, knowing nothing of the secret councils of the Committee, imagined Robespierre to be what he posed, as being the master of the Committee, were eager for his removal. In his fictitious character as the supposed chief power in the state, all the growing nausea against the Terror was directed against his person. Coincidentally with such forces, the committee, whom, relying upon his public position, he had begun to interfere with, and probably to check in their military action, he certainly had attempted unsuccessfully to save certain lives against the decisions of his colleagues, determined to be rid of him. The crisis came in the 4th week of July, or as the revolutionary calendar then went, in the 2nd week of Thermidor. He was howled down in the Parliament. An active and clever conspiracy had organized all the latent forces of opposition to him. He still so trusted in his popularity that the scene bewildered him, and he was still so beloved and so ardently followed that when at the same sitting he was outlawed, his brother sacrificed himself to follow him. Saint Just was included in the sentence, and his strict friend Libas voluntarily accepted the same doom. What followed was at first a confusion of authority. Put under arrest, the governor of the prison to which Robespierre was dispatched refused to receive him. He and his sympathizers met in the Hotel de Ville after the fall of darkness. An attempt was made to provoke an insurrection. There are many and confused accounts of what immediately followed at midnight, but two things are certain. The populace refused to rise for Robespierre, and the Parliament, with the committee at its back, organized an armed force which easily had the better of the incipient rebellion at the Hotel de Ville. It is probable that Robespierre's signature was needed to the proclamation of insurrection. It is certain that he did not complete it, and presumably that he would not act against all his own theories of popular sovereignty and the general will. And he sat there with the paper before him and his signature still unfinished. The armed forces of the Parliament burst into the room. A lad of the name of Merda aimed a pistol from the door at Robespierre and shot him in the jaw. The evidence in favour of this version is conclusive. Of his companions, some fled and were captured. Some killed themselves, most were arrested. The next day, the 10th Thermidor, or 28th of July, 1794, at 7:30 in the evening, Robespierre, with 21 others, was guillotined. The irony of history would have it that the fall of this man, which was chiefly due to his interference with the system of the Terror, broke all the moral force upon which the Terror itself had resided. For men had imagined that the Terror was his work, and that, he gone, no excuse was left for it. A reaction began which makes of this date the true term in that ascending series of revolutionary effort which had by then discussed every aspect of democracy, succeeded in the military defence of that experiment, and laid down, though so far in words only, the basis of the modern state. The end of section 19, the end of phase 6, the end of chapter 4. Section 20, The French Revolution. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The French Revolution by Hilaire Belloc. Section 20, Chapter 5, The Military Aspect of the Revolution. The Revolution would never have achieved its object. On the contrary, it would have led to no less than a violent reaction against those principles which were maturing before it broke out, and which it carried to triumph. Had not the armies of revolutionary France proved successful in the field. But the grasping of this mere historic fact, I mean the success of the revolutionary armies, is unfortunately no simple matter. We all know that, as a matter of fact, the Revolution was, upon the whole, successful in imposing its view upon Europe. We all know that from that success, as from a germ, has proceeded and is still proceeding modern society. But the nature, the cause, and the extent of the military success, which alone made this possible, is widely ignored and still more widely misunderstood. No other signal military effort which achieved its object has in history ended in military disaster. Yet this was the case with the Revolutionary Wars. After 20 years of advance, during which the ideas of the Revolution were sown throughout Western civilization and had time to take root, the armies of the Revolution stumbled into the vast trap or blunder of the Russian campaign. This was succeeded by the decisive defeat of the democratic armies at Leipzig and the superb strategy of the campaign of 1814. The brilliant rally of what is called the 100 Days only served to emphasize the completeness of the apparent failure. For that masterly campaign was followed by Napoleon's first abdication. That brilliant rally ended in Waterloo and the ruin of the French army. When we consider the spread of Grecian culture over the East by the parallel military triumph of Alexander, or the conquest of Gaul by the Roman armies under Caesar, we are met by political phenomena and a political success no more striking than the success of the Revolution. The Revolution did as much by the sword as ever did Alexander or Caesar, and surely compelled one of the great transformations of Europe. But the fact that the great story can be read to a conclusion of defeat disturbs the mind of the student. Again, that element fatal to all accurate study of military history, the imputation of civilian virtues and motives, enters the mind of the reader with fatal facility when he studies the Revolutionary War. He is tempted to ascribe to the enthusiasm of the troops, nay, to the political movement itself, a sort of miraculous power. He is apt to use, with regard to the revolutionary victories, the word inevitable, which, if ever it applies to the reasoned, willing and conscious action of men, certainly applies least of all to men when they act as soldiers. There are 3 points which we must carefully bear in mind when we consider the military history of the Revolution. First, that it succeeded. The Revolution, regarded as the political motive of its armies, won. Secondly, that it succeeded through those military aptitudes and conditions which happened to accompany, but by no means necessarily accompanied, the strong convictions and the civic enthusiasm of the time. Thirdly, that the element of chance, which every wise and prudent reasoner will very largely admit into all military affairs, worked in favour of the Revolution in the critical moments of the early wars. With these points fixed, and with the readiness to return to them when we have appreciated the military story, it is well to begin our study by telling that story briefly and upon its most general lines. In doing so, it will be necessary to cover here and there points which have already been dealt with in this book, but that is inevitable where one is writing of the military aspect of any movement, for it is impossible to deal with that aspect save as a living part of the whole. So knit into the national life is the business of war. 1. When the Revolution first approached action, the prospect of a war between France and any other great power of the time, England, Prussia, the Empire, or let us say Russia, or even Spain, was such a prospect as might have been entertained at any time during the past 2 or 3 generations of men. For pretty well 100 years, men had been accustomed to the consideration of dynastic quarrels supported by a certain type of army, which in a moment I shall describe. I have called these quarrels dynastic. That is, they were mainly quarrels between the ruling houses of Europe, were mainly motivated by the desire of each ruling house to acquire greater territory and revenue, and were limited by the determination of all the ruling houses to maintain certain ideas inviolate, as for instance the sacredness of monarchy, the independence of individual states, etc. Though they were in the main dynastic, yet in proportion as a dynasty might represent a united nation, they were national also. The English oligarchy was in this respect peculiar and more national than any European government of its time. It is also true to say that the Russian despotism had behind it, in most of its military adventures and all its spirit of expansion, the subconscious agreement of the people. Still, however national the wars of the time preceding the Revolution moved within a fixed framework of ideas, as it were, which no commander and no diplomatist dreamed of exceeding. A. The crowned head of state would have some claims against B. the crowned head of another state. With regard to certain territories, C. the crowned head or government of a third state would remain neutral or ally himself with either of the two. If he allied himself, then as a rule it was with the weaker against the stronger, in order to guarantee himself against too great an increase in the part of a rival. Or again, a rebellion would break out against the power of A in some part of his dominions. Then would B, somewhat reluctantly, as the almost unlimited right of an existing executive was still a strong dogma in men's mind, tend to ally himself with the rebels in order to diminish the power of A. Human affairs have always in them very strongly and permanently inherent the chief character of a sport. The interest, at any rate, of males in the conduct of human life is always largely an interest of seeing that certain rules are kept and certain points won according to those rules. We must therefore beware of ridiculing the war of the century preceding the Revolution under the epithet of a game. But it is true that warfare, and honourably true, that it attempted limited things in a limited manner. It did not attempt any fundamental change in society. It was not overtly, since the 30 Years' War at least, a struggle of ideas. It was conducted on behalf of known and limited interests for known and highly limited objects, and the instruments with which it was conducted were instruments artificial and segregated from the general life of the nation. These instruments were what have been called the professional armies. The term is very insufficient and in part misleading. The gentry of the various powers, mixed with whom were certain adventurers, not always of gentle blood, were the officers that led these forces, and for the major part of the gentry in most European countries the military career was the chief field of activity. The men whom they led were not a peasantry nor a working class, still less a civic force in which the middle class would find itself engaged. They were the poorest and the least settled, some would have said the dregs of European life. With the exception here and there of a man, usually a very young man, whom the fabled romance of this hard but glorious trade had attracted, and with the exception of certain bodies that followed in a mass and by order the relics of a feudal lordship, the armies of the period immediately preceding the Revolution were armies of very poor men who had sold themselves into a sort of servitude, often exciting and even adventurous, but not, when we examine it minutely, a career that a free man would choose. The men were caught by economic necessity, by fraud, and in other ways, and once caught were held. No better proof of this could be found than the barbarous severity of the punishments attached to desertion or to minor forms of indiscipline. So held, they were used for the purposes of the game, not only in what would make them serviceable instruments of war, but also in what would make them pleasing to their masters. Strict alignment, certain frills of parade and appearance, all that is required in a theatre or in a pretentious household, appear in the military regulations of this time. The end of section 20. Section 21. The French Revolution. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The French Revolution by Hilaire Belloc. Section 21. Chapter 5. Continued. I must not, in all this, be supposed to be belittling that great period between 1660 and 1789, during which the art of war was most thoroughly thought out, the traditions of most of our great European armies fixed, and the permanent military qualities which we still inherit developed. The men so caught as private soldiers could not but enjoy the game when it was actively played, for men of European stock will always enjoy the game of war. They took glory in its recital and in its memories. To be a soldier, even under the servile conditions of the time, was a proper subject for pride. And it is further to be remarked that the excesses of cruelty discoverable in the establishment of their discipline were also accompanied by very high and lasting examples of military virtue. The behavior of the English contingents at Fontenoy afforded but one of many examples of what I mean. Still, to understand the wars of the Revolution, we must clearly establish the contrast between the so-called professional armies which preceded that movement and the armies which the Revolution invented, used, and bequeathed to the modern world. So also, to revert to what was said above, we must recall the dynastic and limited character of the wars in which the 18th century had been engaged at the outbreak of the Revolution. No other wars were contemplated by men. Had you spoken, for instance, at any moment in 1789 to a statesman, whether of old experience or only introduced to political life by the new movement of the position of Great Britain, he would at once have discussed that position in terms of Great Britain's recent defeat at the hands of France in the affair of the American colonies. Had you discussed with him the position of Prussia, he would at once have argued it in connection with Prussia's secular opposition to Austria and the Empire. Had you asked him how he considered Spain, he would have spoken of the situation of Spain as against France in the light of the fact that Spain was a Bourbon monarchy, allied in blood to the French throne, and so forth. No true statesman imagined at the time, nor indeed for many years, that a war of ideas, nor even strictly speaking of nations, was possible. Even when such a war was actually in process of waging, the diplomacy which attempted to establish a peace, the intrigues whereby alliances were sought or neutrality negotiated, were dependent upon the older conception of things. And the historian is afforded, as he regards this gigantic struggle, the ironic satisfaction of seeing men fighting upon doctrines the most universal conceivable, and yet perpetually changing their conduct during the struggle according to conceptions wholly particular, local, and ephemeral, and soon to be entirely swept away by time. Napoleon himself must needs marry an Austrian archduchess as part of this old prejudice, and for years brains as excellent as Danton's or Talleyrand's conjecture the possibility of treating now England, now Prussia, as neutral to the vast attempt of the French to destroy privilege in European society. One may say that for 2 years the connection of the revolutionary movement with arms had no aspect save that of civil war. True, wherever a considerable change in progress in society, the possibility of foreign war in connection with it must always arise. Were some European state, for instance, to make an experiment in collectivism today, the chance of foreign intervention would certainly be discussed by the promoters of that experiment. But no serious danger of an armed struggle between the French and any of their neighbours in connection with the political experiment of the Revolution was imagined by the mass of educated men in France itself, nor without the boundaries of France during those first 2 years. And I repeat, the military aspect of those years was confined to civil tumult. Nevertheless, that aspect is not to be neglected. The way in which the French organized their civil war, and there was always something of it present from the summer of 1789 onwards, profoundly affected the foreign war that was to follow. For in their internal struggles, great masses of Frenchmen became habituated to the physical presence, millions to the discussion of arms. It is, as we have seen in another part of this book, a repeated and conspicuous error to imagine that the first revolutionary outbreaks were not met sufficiently sternly by royal troops. On the contrary, the royal troops were used to the utmost and were defeated. The populace of the large towns, and especially of Paris, proved itself capable of military organization and of military action. When to this capacity had been added the institution of the militia, called the National Guard, there were already the makings of a nation wholly military. Much of this exceptional and new position must be ascribed to the Gallic character. It may be said that from the fall of the Roman Empire to the present day, that character has been permanently and of its own volition steeped in the experience of organized fighting. Civil tumult has been native to it. The risk of death in defense of political objects has been equally familiar, and the whole trade of arms, its necessary organization, its fatigues, its limiting conditions, have been very familiar to the population throughout all these centuries. But beyond this, the fact that the Revolution prepared men in the school of civil tumult was of the first advantage for its later aptitude against foreign powers. It is always well in history to fix a definite starting point for any political development, and a starting point of the Revolutionary Wars may easily be fixed at the moment when Louis, his queen, and the royal children attempted to escape to the frontier and to the army of the centre under the command of Bouillé. This happened, as we have seen, in June of 1791. Many factors combined to make that date the starting point. In the first place, until that moment, no actual proof had been apparent in the eyes of European monarchs of the captivity of their chief exemplar, the King of France. The wild march upon Versailles, in the days of October 1789, had its parallel in 100 popular tumults with which Europe was familiar enough for centuries. But the rapidly succeeding reforms of the year 1790, and even the great religious blunder of 1791, had received the signature and the public assent of the Crown. The court, though no longer at Versailles, was splendid, the power of the King over the executive still far greater than that of any other organ in the state, and indefinitely greater than that of any other individual in the state. The talk of captivity, of insult and the rest, the outcries of the emigrants, and the perpetual complaint of the French royal family in its private relations seemed exaggerated, or at any rate nothing to act upon. There came the shock of the King's attempted flight and recapture. This clinched things, and it clinched them all the more because more than one court, and especially that of Austria, believed for some days that the escape had been successful. Again, the flight and its failure put the army into a ridiculous posture. Action against the Revolution was never likely so long as the discipline and steadiness of the French army were believed in abroad. But the chief command had hopelessly failed upon that occasion, and it was evident that the French-speaking troops could not easily be trusted by the executive government or by their own commanders. Furthermore, the failure of the flight leads the Queen, with her vivacity of spirit and her rapid though ill-formed plans, to turn for the first time to the idea of military intervention. Her letters suggesting this, in the form of a threat rather than a war, it is true, do not begin until after her capture at Varennes. Finally, coincident with that disaster, was the open mention of a republic, the open suggestion that the King should be deposed, and the first definite and public challenge to the principle of monarchy which the Revolution had thrown down before Europe. We are therefore not surprised to find that this origin of the military movement was followed in 2 months by the declaration of Pillnitz. With the political nature of that declaration one must deal elsewhere. Its military character must here be observed. The declaration of Pillnitz corresponded as nearly as possible to what in the present day would be an order preparatory to mobilizing a certain proportion of the reserve. It cannot with justice be called equivalent to an order calling out all the reserves, still less equivalent to an order mobilizing upon a war footing the forces of a modern nation, for such an action is tantamount to a declaration of war, as for instance was the action of the English government before the South African struggle, and Pillnitz was very far from that. But Pillnitz was certainly as drastic a military proceeding as would be the public intimation by a group of powers that the reserves had been warned in connection with their quarrel against another power. It was, for instance, quite as drastic as the action of Austria against Servia in 1908, and it was intended to be followed by such submission as is expected to follow upon the threat of superior force. Such was the whole burden of Marie Antoinette's letter to her brother, who had called the meeting at Pillnitz, and such was the sense in which the politicians of the Revolution understood it. All that autumn and winter the matter, chiefly watched by foreign diplomatists and the clearest of French thinkers, was the condition of the French forces and of their command. Narbonne's appointment to the War Office counted more than any political move. Dumouriez's succession to him was the event of the time. Plans of campaign were drawn up and promptly betrayed by Marie Antoinette to the enemy. Manifold occasions for actual hostilities were discovered. The Revolution challenged the Emperor in the matter of the Alsatian princes. The Emperor challenged, through Kaunitz, the Revolution in a letter directly interfering with the internal affairs of France and pretending to a right of integrance therein. And on the 20th of April 1792 war was declared against the Empire. Prussia therefore informed the French government that she made common cause with the Emperor, and the revolutionary struggle had begun. The war discovered no serious features during its first 4 months, so slow was the gathering and march of the Allies. But the panics into which the revolutionary troops fell in the first skirmishes, their lack of discipline and the apparent breakdown of the French military power, made the success of the invasion in force, when it should come, seem certain. The invading army did not cross the frontier until more than a week after the fall of the palace. Longwy capitulated at once. A week later, in the 5 days of August, the great frontier forest of Verdun was summoned. It capitulated almost immediately. The end of section 21. Section 22. The French Revolution. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The French Revolution by Hilaire Belloc. Section 22, Chapter 5 continued. The military aspect of the Revolution. 2. On the 2nd of September, Verdun was entered by the Prussians, and a little outside the gates of town, near a village bearing the name of Regret, the Allied camp was fixed. Rather more than a week later, on the 11th, the Allies marched against the line of the Argonne. The reader will remember that this moment, with the loss of the frontier fortress Longwy and Verdun, and the evidence of demoralization which that afforded, was also the moment of the September massacres and of the horrors in Paris. Dumouriez and the mixed French force which he commanded had been ordered by the ministers of war to hold the line of the Argonne against which the Allies were marching. And here it is well to explain what was meant in a military sense by this word line. The Argonne is a long, nearly straight range of hills running from the south northward a good deal to the west of north. Their soil is clay, and though the height of the hills is only 300 feet above the plain, their escarpment or steep side is towards the east, whence an invasion may be expected. They are densely wooded, from 5 to 8 miles broad. The supply of water in them is bad, in many parts undrinkable. Habitation with its provision for armies and roads are extremely rare. It is necessary to insist upon all these details, because the greater part of civilian readers find it difficult to understand how formidable an obstacle so comparatively unimportant a feature in the landscape may be to an army upon the march. It was quite impossible for the guns, the wagons, and therefore the food and ammunition of the invading army to pass through the forest over the drenched clay land of that wet autumn, save where proper roads existed. These were only to be found wherever a sort of natural pass negotiated the range. 3 of these passes alone existed, and to this day there is very little choice in the crossing of these hills. The accompanying sketch will explain their disposition. Through the southernmost went the great high road from the frontier and Verdun to Paris. At the middle one, which is called the Gap of Grand Pré, Dumouriez was waiting with his incongruous army. The third and northern one was also held, but less strongly. The obvious march for an unimpeded invader would have been from Verdun along the high road through the southern pass at Les Islets, and so to Chalons on down to Paris. But Dumouriez, marching down rapidly from the north, had set an advance guard to hold that pass, and was lying himself with the mass of the army on the pass to the north of it at Grand Prix. Against Grand Prix the Prussians marched, and meanwhile the Austrians were attacking the further pass to the north. Both were forced. Dumouriez fell back southwards to Saint-Menehould. Meanwhile Kellermann was coming up from Metz to join him, and all the while the main pass at Les Islets, through which the great road to Paris went, continued to be held by the French. The Prussians and the Austrians joined forces in the plain known as the Champagne-Poulies, which lies westward of Argonne. It will be seen that as they marched south along this plain to meet Dumouriez and to defeat him, their position was a peculiar one. They were nearer the enemy's capital than the enemy's army was, and yet they had to fight with their backs to that capital, and their enemy, the French, had to fight with their faces towards it. Moreover, it must be remarked that the communications of the Allied army were now of a twisted, roundabout sort, which made the conveyance of provisions and ammunition slow and difficult. But they counted upon an immediate destruction of Dumouriez's force, after that a rapid march on the capital. On September 19, Kellermann came up from the south and joined hands with Dumouriez near Saint-Menehould, and on the morning of the 20th his force occupied a roll of land on which there was a windmill, and immediately behind which was the village of Valmy. From this village the ensuing action was to take its name. It must here be insisted upon that both armies had been subjected to the very worst weather for more than a fortnight, but of the two the Prussian force had suffered from this accident much more severely than the French. Dysentery had already broken out, and the length and tortuousness of their communications were greatly emphasized by the conditions of the road. On the morning of that day, the 20th of September, a mist impeded all decisive movement. There was an encounter, half accidental, between an advanced French battery and the enemy's guns, but it was not until mid-morning that the weather lifted enough to show each force its opponent. Then there took place an action, or rather a cannonade, the result of which is more difficult to explain, perhaps, than any other considerable action of the Revolutionary Wars. For some hours the Prussian artillery, later reinforced by the Austrian, cannonaded the French position, having for its central mark the windmill of Valmy, round which the French forces were grouped. At one moment this cannonade took effect upon the limbers and ammunition wagons of the French. There was an explosion which all eyewitnesses have remembered as the chief feature of the firing, and which certainly threw into confusion for some moments the ill-assorted troops under Kellermann's command. At what hour this took place, the witnesses who have left us accounts differ to an extraordinary extent. Some will have it at noon, others toward the middle of the afternoon. So difficult is it to have any accurate account of what happens in the heat of an action. At any rate, if not coincidentally with this success, at some moment not far removed from it the Prussian charge was ordered, and it is here that the difficulties of the historian chiefly appear. That charge was never carried home, whether, as some believe, because it was discovered, after it was ordered, to be impossible in the face of the accuracy and intensity of the French fire, or whether, as it is more probably the case, because the drenched soil compelled the commanders to abandon the movement after it had begun. Whatever the cause may have been, the Prussian force, though admirably disciplined and led, and though advancing in the most exact order, failed to carry out its original purpose. It halted halfway up the slope, and the action remained a mere cannonade without immediate result apparent upon either side. Nevertheless, that result ultimately turned out to be very great, and if we consider its place in history, quite as important as might have been the result of a decisive action. In the first place, the 1 day's delay which it involved was just more than the calculations of the Allies, with their long impeded line of communications, had allowed for. In the next place, a singular increase in determination and moral force was infused into the disheartened and ill-matched troops of the French commanders by this piece of resistance. We must remember that the French force, upon the whole, expected and discounted a defeat. The private soldier especially had no confidence in the result, and to find that the first action which had been so long threatened and had now at last come, he could stand up to the enemy, produced upon him an exaggerated effect which it would never have had under other circumstances. Finally, we must recollect that whatever causes had forbidden the Prussian charge forbade on the next day a general advance against the French position, and all the time the sickness in the Prussian camp was rapidly increasing. Even that short check of 24 hours made a considerable difference. A further delay of but yet another day, during which the Allied army could not decide whether to attack at once or to stand as they were, very greatly increased the list of inefficients from illness. For a whole week of increasing anxiety and increasing inefficiency, the Allied army hung thus impotent, though they were between the French forces and the capital. Dumouriez ably entertained this hesitation, with all its accumulating dangers for the enemy, by prolonged negotiations, until upon the 30th of September the Prussian and Austrian organization could stand the strain no longer, and its commanders determined upon retreat. It was the genius of Danton, as we now know, that chiefly organized the withdrawal of what might still have been a dangerous invading force. It is principally due to him that no unwise jingoism was permitted to claim a trial of strength with the invader, that he was allowed to retire with all his guns, his colours and his train. The retreat was lengthy and unmolested, though watched by the French forces that discreetly shepherded it, but were kept tightly in hand from Paris. It was more than 3 weeks later when the Allied army, upon which Europe and the French monarchy had counted for an immediate settlement of the Revolution, recrossed the frontier, and in this doubtful and perhaps inexplicable fashion the first campaign of the European powers against the Revolution utterly failed. The end of section 22. Section 23. The French Revolution. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The French Revolution by Hilaire Belloc. Section 23. Chapter 5 continued. 3. Following upon this success, Dumouriez pressed on to what had been, from the first moment of his power at the head of the army, his personal plan, to wit, the invasion of the Low Countries. To understand why this invasion failed, and why Dumouriez thought it might succeed, we must appreciate the military and political situation of the Low Countries at the time. They then formed a very wealthy and cherished portion of the Austrian dominions. They had latterly suffered from deep disaffection, culminating in an open revolution, which was due to the Emperor of Austria's narrow and intolerant contempt of religion. From his first foolish policy of persecution and confiscation, he had indeed retreated, but the feeling of the people was still strongly opposed to the government at Vienna. It is remarkable indeed, and in part due to the pressure of a strong Protestant and aristocratic state, Holland to the north of them, that the people of the Austrian Netherlands retained at that time a peculiar attachment to the Catholic religion. The Revolution was quite as anti-Catholic as the Austrian Emperor, but of the persecution of the latter, the Belgians, as we now call them, knew something that of the former they had not yet learnt to dread. It was therefore Dumouriez's calculation that in invading this province of the Austrian power he would be fighting in friendly territory. Again, it was separated from the political centre of the empire. It was therefore more or less isolated politically, and even for military purposes communication with it was not so easy unless indeed Austria could count on a complete cooperation with Prussia, which power had been for now so long her ruthless and persistent rival. Favourable, however, as the circumstances appeared for an invasion, two factors telling heavily against the French had to be counted. The first was the formation of their army. The second, the spirit of rebellion against any anti-Catholic government which had given such trouble to Joseph II. Of these two factors, by far the most important was, of course, the first. If the French forces had been homogeneous, in good spirit and well trained, they might have held what they won. As a fact, they were most unhomogeneous. Great portions of them were ill trained, and worst of all, there was no consistent theory of subordinate command. Men who imagined that subordinate, that is, regimental command in an army could be erected from below, and that a fighting force could resemble a somewhat lax and turbulent democracy, marched alongside of and were actually incorporated with old soldiers who had spent their whole careers under an unquestioned discipline and under a subordinate command, which came to them they knew not whence, and as it were by fate. The mere mixture of two such different classes of men in one force would have been bad enough to deal with. But what was worse, the political theories of the day fostered the military error of the new battalions, though the politicians dared not interfere with the valuable organization of the old. The invasion of the Low Countries began with a great, though somewhat informal and unfruitful success in the victory of Jemappes. It was the first striking and dramatic decisive action which the French, always of an eager appetite for such news, had been given since between 40 and 50 years. The success in America against the English, though brilliantly won and solidly founded, had not presented occasions of this character, and Fontenoy was the last national victory which Paris could remember. Men elderly or old in this autumn of 1792 would have been boys or very young men when Fontenoy was fought. The eager generation of the Revolution, with its military appetites and aptitudes, as yet had hardly expected victory, though victory was ardently desired by them, and peculiarly suitable to their temper. It may be imagined, therefore, what an effect the news of Jemappes had upon the political world in Paris. The action was fought just below the town of Mons, a few miles over the frontier, and consisted in a somewhat ill-ordered but successful advance across the river Haine. Whether because the Austrians, with an inferior force, attempted to hold too long a line, or because the infantry and even the new French volunteer battalions, as yet untried by fatigue, proved irresistible in the centre of the movement, Jemappes was a victory so complete that the attempts of apologists to belittle it only served to enhance its character. Like many another great and apparently decisive action, however, it bore no lasting fruit. Both the factors of which I have spoken above appeared immediately after this success. Belgium was indeed overrun by the French, but in their overrunning of it with something like 80,000 men, they made no attempt to spare the traditions or to conciliate the sympathies of the inhabitants. Hardly was Jemappes won when Mons, the neighbouring fortified frontier town, was at once endowed with the whole machinery of revolutionary government. Church property was invaded and occasionally rifled, and the French paper money, the assignats of which we have heard, poured in to disturb and in places to ruin the excellent commercial system upon which Belgium then as now reposed. Jemappes was fought upon the 6th of November 1792. Brussels was entered upon the 14th, and throughout that winter the Low Countries lay entirely in the hands of the French. The commissioners from the Convention, though endowing Belgium with republican institutions, treated it as a conquered country, and before the breaking of spring the French Parliament voted its annexation to France. This annexation, the determination of the politicians in Paris that the new Belgian government should be republican and anti-Catholic, the maltreatment of the Church in the occupied country, and the increasing ill-discipline and lack of cohesion in his army, left Dumouriez in a position which grew more and more difficult as the new year, 1793, advanced. It must be remembered that this moment exactly corresponded with the execution of the King and the consequent declaration of war by or against France in the case of one power after another throughout Europe. Meanwhile, it was decided, foolishly enough, to proceed from the difficult occupation of Belgium to the still more difficult occupation of Holland, and the siege of Maastricht was planned. The moment was utterly ill-suited for such a plan. Every executive in the civilized world was coalescing openly or secretly, directly or indirectly, against the revolutionary government. The first order to retreat came upon the 8th of March, when the siege of Maastricht was seen to be impossible, and when the great forces of the Allies were gathered again to attempt what was to be the really serious attack upon the Revolution. Something far more dangerous, something which much more nearly achieved success than the march of the comparatively small force which had been checked at Valmy. For 10 days the French retreat continued. When upon the 18th of March Dumouriez risked battle at Neerwinden, his army was defeated. The defeat was not disastrous. The retreat was continued in fairly good order, but a civilian population understands nothing beside the words defeat and victory. It can appreciate a battle, not a campaign. The news of the defeat, coming at a moment of crisis in the politics of Paris, was decisive. It led to grave doubts of Dumouriez's loyalty to the revolutionary government. It shattered his popularity with those who had continued to believe in him, while the general himself could not but believe that the material under his command was rapidly deteriorating. Before the end of the month the army had abandoned all its conquests, and Valenciennes in French territory was reached upon the 27th. The dash upon Belgium had wholly failed. At this moment came one of those political acts which so considerably disturb any purely military conspectus of the revolutionary wars. Dumouriez, at the head of his army, which, though in retreat and defeated, was still intact, determined upon what posterity has justly called treason, but what to his own mind must have seemed no more than statesmanship. He proposed an understanding with the enemy and a combined march upon Paris to restore the monarchical government and put an end to what seemed to him as a soldier a perfectly hopeless situation. He certainly believed it impossible for the French army, in the welter of 1793, to defeat the invader. He saw his own life in peril merely because he was defeated. He had no toleration for the rising enthusiasm or delirium of the political theory which had sent him out, and even before he had reached French territory his negotiations with Coburg, the Austrian commander, had begun. They lasted long. Dumouriez agreed to put the frontier fortress of the French into the hands of the enemy as a guarantee and a pledge, and on the 5th of April all was ready for the alliance of the two armed forces. But just as the treason of Dumouriez is, in the military sense, abnormal and disturbing to any general conspectus of the campaign, so was the action of his army. The doubtful point of a general command, which is political in nature and may be unpopular with the rank and file, lies, of course, in the attitude of the commanders of the units, and these unanimously refused to obey the orders of their chief. It was known that Dumouriez had been summoned to the bar of the Convention, which body had sent commissioners to apprehend him. He had arrested the commissioners and had handed them over as hostages and prisoners to Coburg. So far from Dumouriez upon the critical day handing over his force to the army, or constituting it a part of an allied army to march upon the capital, he was compelled to fly upon the 8th of April. All that disappeared with him, counting many who later deserted back again to the French colours, was less than 1,000 men, and these foreign mercenaries. The end of section 23. Section 24. The French Revolution. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The French Revolution by Hilaire Belloc, Section 24, Chapter 5 continued. The military aspects of the Revolution. The consequence of this strange passage upon the political history of the time we have already seen. Its consequence upon the military history of it was indirect, but profound. The French forces, such as they were still intact, but no general officer could in future be trusted by Paris, and the stimulus which nations in the critical moments of invasion and of danger during foreign war seek in patriotism, in the offering of a high wage to men and of honours and fortunes to their commanders, was now sought by the French in the singular, novel, and abnormal experiment of the Terror. Command upon the frontier throughout 1793 and the first part of 1794, during the critical 14 months, that is, which decided the fate of the Revolution, and which turned the tide of arms in favour of the French, was a task accomplished under the motive power of capital punishment. A blunder was taken as proof of treason, and there lay over the ordering of every general movement the threat of the guillotine. What we have now to follow is somewhat over a year of struggle thus abnormally organized upon the French side, and finally successful through the genius of a great organizer, once a soldier, now a politician, Carnot. The French succeeded by unshakable conviction, which permitted the political leaders to proceed to all extremity in their determination to save the Revolution, by the peculiar physical powers of endurance which their army displayed, and finally, of course, by certain accidents, for accident will always be a determining factor in war. The spring of 1793, the months of April and May, formed the first crisis of the Revolutionary War. The attack about to be delivered is universal, and seems absolutely certain to succeed. With the exception of the rush at Jemappes, where less than 30,000 Austrians were broken through by a torrent superior in numbers, though even there obviously ill-organized, no success had attended the revolutionary armies. Their condition was, even to the eyes of the layman, bad, and to the eye of the expert, hopeless. There was no unity apparent in direction. There were vast lesions in the discipline of the ranks, like great holes torn in some rotten fabric. Even against the forces already mobilized against it, it had proved powerless, and it might be taken for granted that by an act more nearly resembling police work than a true campaign, the Allies would reach Paris, and something resembling the old order be soon restored. What remains is to follow the process by which this expectation was disappointed. The situation at this moment can best be understood by a glance at a sketch map on page 178. Two great French advances had been made in the winter of 1792-93. The one on northern advance, which we have just detailed, the overrunning of Belgium; the other an eastern advance right up to the Rhine and to the town of Mayence. Both had failed. The failure in Belgium, culminating in the treason of Dumouriez, has been read. On the Rhine, where Mayence had been annexed by the French Parliament just as Belgium had been, the active hostility of the population and the gathering of the organized forces of the Allies had the same effect as had been produced in the Low Countries. It was on March 21st, 1793, that the Prussians crossed the Rhine at Bacharach, and within that week the French commander, Custine, began to fall back. On the 1st of April he was back again in French territory, leaving the garrison of Mayence, somewhat over 20,000 men, to hold out as best it could. A fortnight later the Prussians had surrounded the town and the siege had begun. On the northeastern front, stretching from the Ardennes to the sea, a similar state of things was developing. There a barrier of fortresses stood between the Allies and Paris, and a series of sieges corresponding to the siege of Mayence in the east had to be undertaken. At much the same time as the investment of Mayence on April 9th, the first step in this military task was taken by the Allies, moving in between the fortress of Conde and the fortress of Valenciennes. Thenceforward it was the business of the Austrians under Coburg, with the Allies that were to reach him, to reduce the frontier fortresses one by one, and when his communications were thus secure, to march upon Paris. It is here necessary for the reader unacquainted with military history to appreciate 2 points upon which not a little of contemporary historical writing may mislead him. The first is that both in the Rhine Valley and on the Belgian frontier, the forces of the Allies in their numbers and their organization were conceived to be overwhelming. The second is that no competent commander on the spot would have thought of leaving behind him the garrison or even one untaken fortress. It is important to insist upon these points because the political passions roused by the Revolution are still so strong that men can hardly write of it without prejudice and bias, and 2 errors continually present in these descriptions of the military situation in the spring of 1793 are, first, that the Allies were weakened by the Polish question, which was then active, and secondly, that the delay of their commanders before the French fortress was unnecessary. Both these propositions are put forward with the object of explaining the ultimate defeat of the enemies of the Revolution. Both, however great the authority behind them, are unhistorical and worthless. The French success was a military success due to certain military factors, both of design and accident, which will appear in what follows. The Allies played their part as all the art of war demanded it to be played. They were ultimately defeated, not from the commission of any such gross and obvious error in policy or strategy as historians with too little comprehension of military affairs sometimes pretend, but from the military superiority of their opponents. It is true that the Polish question, that is, the necessity the Austrian and Prussian governments were each under of watching that the other was not lessened in importance by the approaching annexations of further Polish territory, with the consequent jealousy and mistrust that arose from this between Austria and Prussia, was a very important feature of the moment. But it is bad military history to pretend that this affected the military situation on the Rhine or in the Netherlands. Every campaign is conditioned by its political object. The political object in this case was to march upon and to occupy Paris. The political object of the campaign once determined, the size and the organization of the enemy are calculated, and a certain force is brought against it. No much larger force is brought than is necessary. To act in such a fashion would be in military art what paying 2 or 3 times the price of an article would be in commerce. The forces of the Allies upon the Rhine and in the Netherlands were, in the opinion of every authority of the time, amply sufficient for their purpose, and more than sufficient. So much more than sufficient that the attitude of that military opinion which had to meet the attack, to wit, the professional military opinion of the French Republican soldiers, was that the situation was desperate. Nor indeed was it attempted to be met save by violent and, as it were, irrational enthusiasm. The second point, the so-called delay involved in the sieges undertaken by the Allies, proves, when it is put forward, an insufficient acquaintance with the contemporary conditions. Any fortress with a considerable garrison left behind, untaken, would have meant the destruction of the Austrian or Prussian communications, and their destruction at a moment when the Austrian and Prussian forces were actually advancing over a desperately hostile country. Moreover, when acting against forces wholly inferior in discipline and organization, an untaken fortress is a refuge which one must take particular pains to destroy. To throw himself into such a refuge will always stand before the commander of those inferior forces as a last resource. It is a refuge which he will certainly avail himself of ultimately if it is permitted to him, and when he has so availed himself of it, it means the indefinite survival of an armed organization in the rear of the advancing invaders. We must conclude, if we are to understand this critical campaign, which changed the history of the world, that Coburg did perfectly right in laying siege to one fortress after another before he began what everyone expected to be the necessarily successful advance on Paris. The French despair, as one town after another surrendered, is an amply sufficient proof of the excellence of his judgment. The end of section 24. Section 25. The French Revolution. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The French Revolution by Hilaire Belloc. Section 25. Chapter 5 continued. The military aspect of the Revolution. We approach the military problem of 1793, therefore, with the following two fields clear before us. One, in the northeast, an advance on Paris, the way to which is blocked by a quadrilateral of fortresses, Mons, Maubeuge, Conde, and Valenciennes, with the subsidiary stronghold of Lesquenois in the neighbourhood of Last. Mons has been in Austrian hands since Dumouriez's retreat. Conde is just cut off from Valenciennes by Coburg's advance, but it has not fallen. Valenciennes and the neighbouring Lesquenois are still intact, and so is Maubeuge. All must be reduced before the advance on Paris can begin. Behind these fortresses is a French army incapable as yet of attacking Coburg's command with any hope of success. Such is the position in the last fortnight of April. 2. Meanwhile, on the Rhine, the French garrison in Mayence is besieged. Custine, the French commander in that quarter, has fallen back on the French town of Landau and is drawing up what are known in history as the lines of Weissenburg. The accompanying sketch map explains their importance. Reposing upon the two obstacles of the rivers of the right and the mountains of the left, they fulfill precisely the same functions as a fortress, and those functions we have just described. Until these lines were carried, the whole of Alsace may be regarded as a fortress, defended by the mountains and the river on two sides, and by the lines of Weissenburg on the third. A reader unacquainted with military history may ask why the obstruction was not drawn upon the line of the Prussian advance of Paris. The answer is that the presence of a force behind fortifications anywhere in the neighbourhood of a line of communication is precisely equivalent to an obstacle lying right upon those lines. For no commander can go forward along the line of his advance and leave a large undestroyed force close to one side of that line, and so situated that it can come out when he has passed and cut off his communications. For it is by communications that an army lives, especially when it is marching in hostile country. Custine, therefore, behind his lines of Weissenburg and the besieged garrison in Mayence, corresponded to the barrier of fortresses on the northeast and delayed the advance of the Prussians under Wurmser and Brunswick from the Rhine, just as Conde, Valenciennes and Maubeuge prevented the advance of Coburg on the northeast. Such in general was the situation upon the eastern frontier at the end of that month of April, 1793. 4. Let us first follow the development of the northern position. It will be remembered that all Europe was at war against the French. The Austrians had for allies Dutch troops, which joined them at this moment, and certain English and Hanoverian troops under the Duke of York, who also joined them. At this moment, when Coburg found himself increasing strength, a tentative French attack upon him was delivered and failed. Dampierre, who was in command of all this French army of the north, was killed, and Custine was sent to replace him. The army of the north did not, as perhaps it should have done, concentrate into one body to meet Coburg's threatened advance. It was perpetually attempting diversions which were useless because its strength was insufficient. Now it feinted upon the right towards Namur, now along the sea-coast on the left, and these diversions failed in their object. Before the end of the month, Coburg, to give himself elbow room, as it were, for the siege which he was preparing, compelled the main French force to retreat to a position well behind Valenciennes. It was immediately after this success of Coburg's that Custine arrived to take command of the Belgian frontier, his place on the Rhine being taken by Houchard. Custine was a very able commander, but a most unlucky one. His plan was the right one, to concentrate all the French forces, abandoning the Rhine, and so form the army sufficiently to cope with Coburg's. The government would not meet him in this, and he devoted himself immediately to the reorganization of the army of the North alone. The month of June and half of July was taken up in that task. Meanwhile, the Austrian siege work had begun, and Conde was the first object of its attention. Upon July 10th, Conde fell. Meanwhile, Custine had been recalled to Paris, and Valenciennes was invested. Custine was succeeded by Kilmaine, a general of Irish extraction who maintained his position for but a short time, and was unable, while he maintained it, to do anything. The forces of the Allies continually increased. The number at Coburg's disposal, free from the business of besieging Valenciennes, was already larger than the force required for that purpose, and yet another 15,000 Hessian troops marched in, while the issue of that siege was still in doubt. This great advantage in numbers permitted him to get rid of the main French force that was still present in front of him, though not seriously annoying him. This force lay due southwest of Valenciennes, and was about a day's march distance. He depended for the capture of it upon his English and Hanoverian allies under the Duke of York, but that general's march failed. The distance was too much for his troops in the hot summer weather, and the French were able to retreat behind the line of the Scarpe and save their army intact. The Duke of York's talents have been patriotically exaggerated in many a treatise. He always failed, and this was among the most signal of his failures. Kilmaine had hardly escaped from York, drawn up his army behind the Scarpe, and put it into a position of safety, when in his turn was deprived of the command, and Houchard was taken from the Rhine, just as Custine had been, and put at the head of the army of the North. Before the main French army had taken up this position of safety, Valenciennes had fallen. It fell on the 28th of July, and its fall, inevitable though it was, and, as one may say, taken for granted by military opinion, was much the heaviest blow yet delivered. Nothing of importance remained to block the march of the armies of the Allies, save Maubeuge. At about the same moment occurred three very important changes in the general military situation, which the reader must note if he is to understand what follows. The first was the sudden serious internal menace opposed to the Republican government. The second was the advent of Carnot to power, and the third was the English diversion upon Dunkirk. The serious internal menace which the government of the Republic had to face was the widespread rebellion which has been dealt with in the earlier part of this book. The action of the Paris radicals against the Girondins had raised whole districts in the provinces. Marseille, which had shown signs of disaffection since April and had begun to raise a local reactionary force, revolted. So did Bordeaux, Nimes, and other great southern towns. Lyons had risen at the end of May and had killed the Jacobin mayor of the town of the period between the fall of Conde and that of Valenciennes. The troop which Marseille had raised against the Republic was defeated in the field only the day before Valenciennes fell, but the great seaport was still unoccupied by the forces of the government. The Norman march upon Paris had also failed between those two dates, the fall of Conde and the fall of Valenciennes. The Norman bark had proved worse than the Norman bite, but the force was so neighbouring to the capital that it took a very large place in the preoccupations of the time. The Vendéan revolt, though its triumphant advance was checked before Nantes a fortnight before the fall of Conde, was still vigorous, and the terrible reprisals against it were hardly begun. Worst of all, or at least worst perhaps after the revolt of Lyons, was the defection of Toulon. Toulon rose 2 days before the fall of Valenciennes, and was prepared to hand itself over, as at last it did hand itself over, to occupation by the English fleet. The end of section 25. Section 26. The French Revolution. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The French Revolution by Hilaire Belloc. Section 26. Chapter 5. Continued. The military aspect of the Revolution. The dates thus set in their order may somewhat confuse the reader, and I will therefore summarize the general position of the internal danger thus. A man in the French camp on the Scheldt, listening to the guns before Valenciennes 15 miles away, and hourly expecting their silence as a signal that the city had surrendered, would have heard by one post after another how Marseilles still held out against the government, how the counter-attack against the successful Vendéans had but doubtfully begun. All July was full of disasters in that quarter. How Lyons was furiously successful in her rebellion and had dared to put to death the Republican mayor of the town, and that the great arsenal and port of Toulon, the Portsmouth of France upon the Mediterranean, had sickened of the government and was about to admit the English fleet. His only comfort would have been to hear that the Norman march on Paris had failed. But he would still be under the impression of it, and of the murder of Marat by a Norman woman. There is the picture of that sudden internal struggle which coincides with this moment of the Revolutionary War, the moment of the fall of Condé and of Valenciennes and the exposure of the frontier. The second point, the advent of Carnot into the Committee of Public Safety, which has already been touched upon in the political part of this work, has so preponderating a military significance that we must consider it here also. The old Committee of Public Safety, it will be remembered, reached the end of its legal term on July 10. It was the committee which the wisdom of Danton had controlled. The members elected to the new committee did not include Carnot, but the military genius of this man was already public. He came of that strong middle class which is the pivot upon which the history of modern Europe turns. A Burgundian, with lineage intensely republican, he had been returned to the Convention and had voted for the death of the king. A sapper before the Revolution, and one thoroughly well grounded in his arm and in general reading of military things, he had been sent by the Convention to the Army of the North on commission. He had seen its weakness and had watched its experiments. Upon his return he was not immediately selected for the post in which he was to transform the Revolutionary War. It was not until the 14th of August that he was given a temporary place upon the committee, which his talents very soon made permanent. He was given a place merely as a stopgap to the odious and incompetent fanatic Saint Andres, who was for the moment away on mission. But from the day of his admission his superiority in military affairs was so incontestable that he was virtually a dictator therein, and his first action after the general lines of organization had been laid down by him was to impose upon the frontier armies the necessity of concentration. He introduced what afterwards Napoleon inherited from him, the tactical venture of all upon one throw. It must be remembered that Carnot's success did not lie in any revolutionary discovery in connection with the art of war, but rather in that vast capacity for varied detail which marks the organizer, and in an intimate sympathy with the national character. He understood the contempt for parade, the severity or brutality of discipline, the consciousness of immense powers of endurance which are in the Frenchman when he becomes a soldier, and he made use of this understanding of his. It must be further remembered that this powerful genius had behind him in these first days of his activity the equally powerful genius of Danton. For it was Danton, and he, who gave practical shape to that law of conscription by which the French Revolution suddenly increased its armed forces by nearly 500,000 of men, restored the Roman tradition, and laid the foundation of the armed system on which Europe today depends. With Carnot virtually commander-in-chief of all the armies, and able to impose his decisions in particular upon that army of the North which he had studied so recently as a commissioner, the second factor of the situation I am describing is comprehended. The third, as I have said, was the English diversion upon Dunkirk. The subsequent failure of the Allies has led to bitter criticism of this movement. Had the Allies not failed, history would have treated it as its contemporaries treated it. The forces of the Allies on the northeastern frontier were so great, and their confidence so secure, especially after the fall of Valenciennes, that the English proposal to withdraw their forces for the moment from Coburg's and to secure Dunkirk was not received with any destructive criticism. 18 battalions and 14 squadrons of the Imperial forces were actually lent to the Duke of York for this expedition. What is more, even after that diversion failed, the plan was fixed to begin again when the last of the other fortresses should have fallen. So little was the English plan for the capture of the seaport disfavoured by the commander-in-chief of the Allies. That diversion on Dunkirk turned out, however, to be an error of capital importance. The attempt to capture the city utterly failed, and the victory which accompanied its repulsion had upon the French that indefinable but powerful moral effect which largely contributed to their future successes. The accompanying sketch map will explain the position. Valenciennes and Conde have fallen. Lesquenoy, the small fortress subsidiary to Valenciennes, had not yet been attacked, but comes next in the series, when the moment was judged propitious for the detachment of the Anglo-Hanoverian force with a certain number of imperial allies to march to the sea. It must always be remembered by the reader of history that military situations, like the situations upon a chessboard, rather happen than are designed, and the situation which developed at the end of September upon the extreme north and west of the line which the French were attempting to hold against the Allies was strategically of this nature. When the Duke of York insisted upon a division of the forces of the Allies and the attack upon Dunkirk, no living contemporary foresaw disaster. Coburg, indeed, would have preferred the English to remain with him and asked them to do so, but he felt in no sort of danger through their temporary absence, nor, as a matter of fact, was he in any danger through it. Again, though, the positions which the Duke of York took up when he arrived in front of Dunkirk were bad. Neither his critics at home, nor any of his own subordinates, nor any of the enemy perceived fully how bad they were. It was, as will presently be seen, a sort of drift, bad luck combined with bad management, which led to this British disaster, and what was all important for the conduct of the war, to the first success in a general action which the French had to flatter and encourage themselves with during all that fatal summer. The Duke of York separated his force from that of Coburg just before the middle of August. Besides the British, who were not quite 7,000 strong, 11,000 Austrians, over 10,000 Hanoverians, and 7,000 Hessians were under his command. The total force, therefore, was nearly 37,000 strong. No one could imagine that, opposed by such troops as the French were able to put into the line, and marching against such wretched defences as those of Dunkirk then were, the Duke's army had not a perfectly easy task before it, and the plan which was to take Dunkirk and upon the return to join the Austrian march on Paris was reasonable and feasible. It is important that the reader should firmly seize this and not read history backward from future events. Certain faults are to be observed in the first conduct of the march. It began on the 15th of August, proceeding from Marchiennes to Menin, and at the outset displayed that deplorable lack of marching power which the Duke of York's command had shown throughout the campaign. From Marchiennes to Torgau is a long day's march. It took the Duke of York 4 days, and take the march altogether, 9 days were spent in covering less than 40 miles. In the course of that march the British troops had an opportunity of learning to despise their adversary. They found in Linselles upon the flank of their advance a number of undisciplined boys who broke the moment the guards were upon them, and whose physical condition excited the ridicule of their assailants. The army proceeded after this purposeless and unfruitful skirmish to the neighbourhood of the sea coast, and the siege of Dunkirk was undertaken under conditions which will be clear to the reader from the following sketch map. Footnote. Incidentally, it should be noted how true it is that this supreme military quality is a matter of organization rather than of the physical power of the troops. In the Napoleonic Wars, the marching power of the English troops was often proved exceptional, and perhaps the greatest of all feats accomplished by a small body was that of the Light Brigade, marching to the succour of Wellington at Talavera. The end of section 26. Section 27. The French Revolution. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The French Revolution by Hilaire Belloc. Section 27, Chapter 5 continued. The military aspect of the Revolution. The date of the 20th of August must first be fixed in the mind. On that date the army which was to take Dunkirk was separated into its two component parts. The first, under the Duke of York, was to attack the town itself. The second, under the aged Austrian General Freytag, was to watch the movement of any approaching enemy and to cover the force which was besieging the town. 2 days later the Duke of York was leaving Furnes, which he had made his base for the advance, and Freytag had, with the greatest ease, brushed the French posts, mainly of volunteers, from before him, and was beginning to take up the flanking positions south and east of Bergues, which covered the siege of Dunkirk. 2 days later, on August 24th, Freytag had occupied Wormhout and Esquelbecque, capturing guns by the dozen, doing pretty well what he would with the French outposts, and quite surrounding the town of Bergues. Wilder was in his headquarters. On the same day, the 24th, the Duke of York had with the greatest ease driven in the advanced posts of the French before Dunkirk, and shut up the enemy within the town, while he formed his besieging force outside of it, entrenched in a position which he had chosen beforehand, reposing upon the sea at his right, his left on the villages of Tettinghem. He was then about 3,000 yards from the fortifications at Dunkirk. Such was the situation upon the dawn of the 25th, when everything was ready for active operations. And here the reader must look upon the map for what ultimately proved the ruin of the situation. Supposing Freytag round Bergues in the position which the map shows, the Duke of York in front of Dunkirk as the map also shows him, the two forces are in touch across the road and the belt of country which unites Bergues and Dunkirk. The covering armies and the besieging force which it covers are each a wing of one combined body. Each communicates with the other, each can support the other at the main point of effort, and though between the one and the other eastward there stretches a line of marshy country, the Meres, which the map indicates, yet a junction between the two forces exists westward of these, and the two armies can co-operate by the Bergues-Dunkirk road. A factor which the Duke of York may have neglected was the power of flooding all that flat country round the road which the French in Dunkirk, being in possession of the sluices, possessed. They used it at once. They drowned the lowlands to the south of Dunkirk upon the very day when the last dispositions of the attacking force were completed. But more important, and never yet explained, was the Austrians' abandonment of Coudecourt. By this error the main road itself, standing above the flood, was lost, and from being one strong army the force of the Allies became two weak ones. Communication was no longer possible between the Duke of York and Freytag's territories, and it was of this separation that the French, in spite of their deplorable organization and more deplorable personnel, took advantage. They took advantage of it slowly. Houchard gathered altogether 40,000 men near Cassel, but it was 10 days before they could be concentrated. It must again be insisted upon and repeated that, large as the number was, it was 4 times as great as Freytag's now isolated force. Houchard's command was made up of men quite 2/3 of whom were hardly soldiers, volunteers, both new and recent, ill-trained conscripts, and so forth. There was no basis of discipline, hardly any power to enforce it. The men had behaved disgracefully in all the affairs of outposts. They had been brushed away contemptuously by the small Austrian force from every position they had held. With all this numerical superiority, the attempt which Houchard was about to make was very hazardous, and Houchard was a hesitating and uncertain commander. Furthermore, of the 40,000 men, 1/4 at least remained out of action through the ineptitude and political terror of Dumancy, Houchard's lieutenant upon the right. It was upon the 6th of September that the French advance began along the whole line. It was a mere pushing in of inferior numbers by superior numbers, the superior numbers perpetually proving themselves inferior to the Austrians in military value. Thus the capture of old Freytag himself in a night skirmish was at once avenged by the storming of the village near which he had been caught, and he was retaken. In actual fighting and force for force, Houchard's command found nothing to encourage it during these first operations. The Austrians, in falling back, concentrated and were soon one compact body. To attack and dislodge it was the object of the French advance, but an object hardly to be obtained. What happened was not only the unexpected success of this advance, but the gaining by the French of the first decisive action in the long series which was to terminate 20 years later at Leipzig. The army of Freytag fell back upon the village of Hondschoote and stood there in full force upon the morning of Sunday the 8th of September. Houchard attacked it with a force greatly lessened but still double that of the defenders. So conspicuous, however, was the superiority of the Austrian regulars over the French raw troops and volunteers that during this morning of the 8th the result was still doubtful. By the afternoon, however, the work was done, and the enemy were in a retreat which might easily have been turned into a rout. A glance at the map will show that Houchard, had he possessed the initiative common to so many of his contemporaries, might at once have driven the numerically inferior and heavily defeated force (it had lost 1/3 of its men) to the right, and proceeded himself to cut the communications of the Duke of York and to destroy his army, which lay packed upon the waterless sand dunes where the village of Malo-les-Bains now stands. Houchard hesitated. Freytag escaped. The Duke of York, abandoning his siege pieces to the number of 40 and much of his heavy baggage, retreated precipitously through the night to Furnes, right across the front of the French army, and escaped destruction. The Battle of Hondschoote, therefore, as it is called, raised the siege of Dunkirk. It was, as I have said, the first successful, decisive action which the Revolution could count since the moment of its extreme danger and the opening of the general European war. But it was nothing like what it might have been had Houchard been willing to risk a hearty stroke. Houchard was therefore recalled, condemned to death, and executed by the Committee of Public Safety, whose pitiless despotism was alone capable of saving the nation. He remains the single example of a general officer who has suffered death for military incompetence after the gaining of a victory, and his execution is an excellent example of the way in which the military temper of the Committee, and particularly of Carnot, refused to consider any factor in the war save those that make for military success. Carnot and the Committee had no patience with the illusions which a civilian crowd possesses upon mere individual actions. What they saw was the campaign as a whole, and they knew that Houchard had left the armies opposite him intact. Perhaps his execution was made more certain by the continuance of bad news from that more important point of the frontier, the direct line of Austrian advance upon Paris. Here already Valenciennes had fallen 2 months before, and Conde also. Lesquenoy, the third point of the barrier line, capitulated on the 11th of September, and the news of that capitulation reached Paris immediately after the news of Hondschoote. No fortress was now left between the Allies and the capital, but Maubeuge. Coburg marched upon it at once. Not only had he that immense superiority in the quality of his troops which must be still insisted upon, but numerically also he was 3-1 when on the 28th of September at dawn he crossed the Sambre above and below Maubeuge, and by noon of that day had contained the French army in the neighbourhood within the lines of the fortress. The situation was critical in the extreme. Maubeuge was ill prepared to stand siege. It was hardly provisioned. Its garrison was of varied and on the whole of bad quality. In mere victuals it could stand out but for a few days, and worst of all, it had behind it the continued example of necessary and fatal surrenders which had marked the whole summer. The orders of the Committee of Public Safety to its commander were terse: "Your heads shall answer for Maubeuge." After the receipt of that message, no more came through the lines. The end of section 27. Section 28. The French Revolution. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The French Revolution by Hilaire Belloc. Section 28, Chapter 5 continued. The military aspect of the Revolution. The reader, if he be unaccustomed to military history, does well to note that in every action and in every campaign there is some one factor of position or of arms or of time which explains the result. Each has a pivot or hinge, as it were, upon which the whole turns. It was now upon Maubeuge that the Revolutionary War thus depended. At risk of oversimplifying a complex story, I would lay down as the prime condition for the understanding of the early revolutionary wars: had Maubeuge fallen, the road to Paris lay open, and the trick was done. And here we must consider again the effect in the field of Carnot's genius. In the first place, he had provided numbers, not on paper but in reality. The Committee, though a decree of the Assembly had despotically requisitioned men, animals, vehicles and supplies, the levy was a reality. Mere numbers, then raw but increasing, had begun to pour into the northeast. It was they that had told at Hondschoote. It was they that were to tell in front of Maubeuge. Footnote: I must not, in fairness to the reader, neglect the great mass of opinion from Jomini to Fortescue's classic work upon the British Army, which lays it down that the Allies had but to mask the frontier fortresses and to advance their cavalry rapidly along the Paris road. Historical hypotheses can never be more than a matter of judgment, but I confess that this view has always seemed to me to ignore, as purely military historians and especially foreign ones might well ignore, the social condition of '93. Cavalry is the weakest of all arms with which to deal with sporadic, unorganized, but determined resistance. To pass through the densely populated country of the Paris road may be compared to the forcing of an open town, and cavalry can never be relied upon for that. As for the army moving as a whole without a perfect security in its communications, the matter need not even be discussed. It must further be remembered that The moment such an advance began, an immediate concentration from the north would have fallen upon the ill-guarded lines of supply. It may be taken that Coburg knew his business when he sat down before this, the last of the fortresses. Secondly, as the committee supplied the necessary initiative, Carnot supplied the necessary personality of war. His own will and his own brain would come to one decision in one moment, and did so. It was he, as we shall see, who won the critical action. He chose Jourdan, a man whose quaint military career we must reluctantly leave aside in so brief a study as this, but at any rate an amateur, and put him in Houchard's command over the army of the northern frontier, and that command was extended from right away beyond the Ardennes to the sea. He ordered, and Jourdan obeyed, the concentration of men from all down that lengthy line to the right and to the left upon one point, Guise. To leave the rest of the frontier weak was a grave risk only to be excused by very rapid action and success. Both these were to follow. The concentration was effected in 4 days. Troops from the extreme north could not come in time. The furthest called upon were beyond Arras, with 65 miles of route between them and Guise. This division, which shall be typical of many, not quite 8,000 strong, left on receiving orders in the morning of the 3rd of October and entered Guise in the course of the 6th. The rate of marching and the synchronicity of these movements of imperfect troops should especially be noted by anyone who would understand how the Revolution succeeded. A second division of over 13,000 men followed along the parallel road, with a similar timetable. From the other end of his line, a detachment under Beauregard, just over 4,000 men, was called up from the extreme right. It will serve as a typical example upon the eastern side of this lightning concentration. It had been gathered near Carignan, a town fully 14 miles beyond Sedan. It picked up reinforcements on the way and marched into Fourmies upon the 11th after covering just 70 miles in the 3.5 days. With its arrival the concentration was complete, and not a moment too soon, for the bombardment of Maubeuge was about to begin. From the 11th to the 15th of October the army was advanced and drawn up in line, a day's march in front of Guise, with its centre at Avesnes, and facing the covering army of Coburg, which lay entrenched upon a long wooded crest, with the valley of the Sambre upon the right and the village of Wattignies on a sort of promontory of high land upon the left. The Austrian position was reconnoitred upon the 14th. Upon the 15th the general attack was delivered and badly repelled. When darkness fell upon that day, few in the army could have believed that Maubeuge was succourable. It was a question of hours. Carnot, however, sufficiently knew the virtues as the vices of his novel troops. The troops of the great levy, stiffened with a proportion of regulars, to attempt an extraordinary thing. He marched 8,000 from his left and centre over to his right during the night, and in the morning of the 16th his right in front of the Austrian left at Wattignies had by this conversion become far the strongest point of the whole line. A dense mist had covered the end of this operation as the night had covered it in its inception, and that mist endured until nearly midday. The Austrians upon the heights had no hint of the conversion, and Wattignies was only held by 3 regiments. If they expected a renewed attack at all, they can only have expected it in the centre or even upon the left, where the French had suffered most the day before. Initiative in war is essentially a calculation of risk, and with high initiative the risk is high. What Carnot gambled upon, for Jourdan was against the experiment when he moved those young men through the night, was the possibility of getting active work out of them after a day's furious action. The forced marches of the preceding week, and on top of it all a sleepless night of further marching. Most of the men who were prepared to charge on the French right, as the day broadened and the mist lifted on that 16th of October, had been on foot for 30 hours. The charge was delivered and was successful. The unexpected numbers thus concentrated under Wattignies carried that extreme position, held the height, and arrived therefore on the flank of the whole Austrian line, which, had not the effort of the aggressors exhausted them, would have been rolled up in its whole length. As it was, the Austrians retreated unmolested and in good order across the Sambre. The siege of Maubeuge was raised, and the next day the victorious French army entered the fortress. Thus was successfully passed the turning point of the revolutionary wars. 2 months later the other gate of that country was recovered. In the moment when Maubeuge was relieved, the enemy had pierced the lines of Wissembourg. It is possible that an immediate and decisive understanding among the Allies might then have swept all Alsace, but such an understanding was lacking. The disarrayed army of the Rhine was got into some sort of order, notably through the enthusiasm of Hoche and the silent control of Pichegru. At the end of November the Prussians stood on the defensive at Kaiserslautern. Hoche hammered at them for 3 days without success. What really turned the scale was the floods of men and material that the levy and the requisitioning were pouring in. Just before Christmas the enemy evacuated Hagenau. Landau they still held, but a decisive action fought upon Boxing Day, a true soldier's battle determined by the bayonet, settled the fate of the Allies on this point. The French entered Wissembourg again, and Landau was relieved after a siege of 4 months and a display of tenacity which had done not a little to turn the tide of the war. The end of section 28. Section 29. The French Revolution. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The French Revolution by Hilaire Belloc. Section 29, Chapter 5 continued. The military aspect of the Revolution. Meanwhile, the news had come in that the last of the serious internal rebellions was crushed. Toulon had been recaptured, the English fleet driven out. The town, the harbour and the arsenal had fallen into the hands of the French, largely through the science of a young major of artillery, not captain. I have discussed the point elsewhere. Bonaparte and this had taken place a week before the relief of Landau. The last confused horde of La Vendée had been driven from the walls of Granville in Normandy, to which it had erred and drifted rather than retreated. At Mans on the 13th of December it was cut to pieces, and at Savenay on the 23rd, 3 days before the great victory at Alsace, it was destroyed. A long peasant and bandit struggle, desperate, yet hardly to be called guerrilla, continued through the next year behind the hedges of Lower Brittany and of Vendée. But the danger to the state and to the Revolution was over. The year 1793 ended, therefore, with the complete relief of the whole territory of the Republic, save a narrow strip upon the Belgian frontier, complete domination of it by its Caesar, the Committee of Public Safety, with 2/3 of a million of men under arms, and the future of the great experiment apparently secure. The causes of the wonder have been discussed, and will be discussed indefinitely. Primarily, they reside in the recreation of a strong central power, secondly, in the combination of vast numbers and of a reckless spirit of sacrifice. The losses on the national side were perpetually and heavily superior to those of the Allies. In Alsace they had been 3-1, and we shall better understand the duel when we appreciate that in the short 8 years between the opening of the war and the triumph of Napoleon at Marengo, there had fallen in killed and wounded on the French side over 700,000 men. 5. The story of 1794 is but the consequence of what we have just read. It was the little belt or patch upon the Belgian frontier that was still in the hands of the enemy that determined the nature of the campaign. It was not until spring that the issue was joined. The Emperor of Austria reached Brussels on the 2nd day of April, and a fortnight later reviewed his army. The French line, drawn up in opposition to it, suffered small but continual reverses until the close of the month. On the 29th, Clerfayt suffered a defeat which led to the fall, or rather the escape, of the small garrison of Menin. Clerfayt was beaten again at Courtenay a fortnight later, but all these early engagements in the campaign were of no decisive moment. Tourcoing was to be the first heavy blow that should begin to settle matters. Fleurus was to clinch them. No battle can be less satisfactorily described in a few lines than that of Tourcoing. So different did it appear to either combatant, so opposite are the plans of what was expected on either side and of what happened, so confused are the various accounts of contemporaries. The accusations of treason, which nearly always arise after a disaster, and especially a disaster overtaking an Allied force, are particularly monstrous and may be dismissed. In particular, the childish legend which pretends that the Austrians desired an English defeat. What the French say is that excellent forced marching and scientific concentration permitted them to attack the enemy before the junction of his various forces was effected. What the Allies say is, if they are speaking for their centre, that it was shamefully abandoned and unsupported by the two wings. If they are speaking for the wings, that the centre had no business to advance when it saw that the two wings were not up in time to cooperate. One story goes that the Archduke Charles was incapacitated by a fit. Lord Acton has lent his considerable authority to this amusing version. At any rate, what happened was this. The Allies lay along the river Scheldt on Friday, the 16th of May. Tournay was their centre, with the Duke of York in command of the chief force there. 5 or 6 miles north down the river was one extremity of their line, at a place called Warcoing. It was a body of Hanoverians. The left, under the Archduke Charles, was Austrian, and had reached a place a day's march south of Tournay called Saint-Amand. Over against the Allies lay a large French force, also occupying a wide front over 15 miles, the centre of which was Tourcoing, then a village. Its right was in front of the fortress of Courtrai. Now, behind the French, up country, northward in the opposite direction from the lines of Allies on the Scheldt, was another force of the Allies under Clerfayt. The plan was that the Allied right should advance on to Mouscron and to take it. The Allied centre should advance on to Tourcoing and Mauveaux and take them, while the left should march across the upper waters of the river Marske, forcing the bridges that crossed that marshy stream and come up alongside the centre. In other words, there was to be an attack all along the French line from the south, and while it was proceeding, Clerfayt from the north of the French was to cross Lys and attack also. On the day of the 17th, what happened was this. The left of the Allies, marching from Saint-Amand, came up half a day late. The right of the Allies took Mouscron, but were beaten out of it by the French. The centre of the Allies fulfilled their programme, reaching Tourcoing and its neighbourhood by noon, and holding their positions. It is to the honour of English arms that this success was accomplished by a force, a third of which was British, and the most notable bayonet work in which was done by the Guards. Meanwhile, Clerfayt was late in moving and in crossing the river Lys, which lay between him and his objective. When night fell, therefore, on the first day of the action, a glance at the map will show that instead of one solid line advancing against the French from A to B, and the northern force in touch with it at C, the Allied formation was in an absurd projection in the middle, due to the success of the mixed and half-British force under the Duke of York, a success which had not been maintained on the two wings. A bulge of this sort in an attacking line is on the face of it disastrous. The enemy have only to be rapid in falling upon either flank of it, and the bulge can be burst in. The French were rapid and burst in. The Bulge was. By concentrating their forces against this one central part of the Allies, they fought 3-1. That same capacity which at Wattignies had permitted them to scorn sleep and to be indefatigable in marching, put them on the road before 3 o'clock in the morning of Sunday the 18th, and with the dawn they fell upon the central forces of the Allies, attacking it from all three sides. It is on this account that the battle is called the Battle of Tourcoing, for Tourcoing was the most advanced point to which the centre of the Allies had reached. The Germans upon the Duke of York's right at Tourcoing felt the first brunt of the attack. The Duke of York himself, with his mixed half-British force, came in for the blow immediately afterwards, and while it was still early morning the Germans at Tourcoing began to fall back. The Duke of York's force to the left of them was left isolated. Its commander ought not to have hung on so long, but the defence was maintained with the utmost gallantry for the short time during which it was still possible. The retreat began about 9 in the morning and was kept orderly for the first 2 miles, but after that point it was a rout. The drivers of the British cannon fled, and the guns left without teams blocked the precipitate flight of the cavalry. Their disorder communicated itself at once to the guards and to the line. Even in this desperate strait some sort of order was restored, notably by the Guards Brigade, which were apparently the first to form, and a movement that could still be called a retreat was pursued towards the south. The Duke of York himself was chased from spinney to spinney, and escaped by a stroke of luck, finding a bridge across the last brook held by a detachment of Hessians. In this way were the central columns, who between them numbered not a third of the total force of the Allies, destroyed. Clairfayt had first advanced, but far too late to save the centre, and then retreated. The Archduke Charles upon the left was 4 hours late in marching to the help of the Duke of York. The right wing of the Allies was not even late. It spent the morning in an orderly artillery duel with the French force opposed to it. By 5 in the afternoon defeat was admitted and a general retreat of the Allies ordered. The end of section 29. Section 30. The French Revolution. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The French Revolution by Hilaire Belloc. Section 30, Chapter 5 concluded. The military aspect of the Revolution. I have said that many reasons are given to account for the disaster of Tourcoing, one of the very few in which a British force has been routed upon the continent. But I confess that if I were asked for an explanation of my own, I would say that it was simply due to the gross lack of synchrony on the part of the Allies, and that this in its turn was taken advantage of by the power both of vigil and of marching which the French troops, still inferior in most military characteristics, had developed and maintained, and which, a more important matter, their commanders knew how to use. This heavy blow, delivered on the 18th of May, in spite of a successful rally a week later, finally convinced the Emperor that the march on Paris was impossible. 11 days later, on the 29th, it was announced in the camp of Tournay, upon which the Allied army had fallen back, that the Emperor had determined to return to Vienna. The Allied army was indeed still left upon that front, but the French continued to pour up against it. It was again their numbers that brought about the next and final victory. Far off, upon the east of that same line, the army which is famous in history and in song as that of the Sambre at Meuse, was violently attempting to cross the Sambre and to turn the line of the Allies. Coburg reinforced his right opposite the French left, but numbers had begun to bewilder him. The enthusiasm of Saint-Just, the science of Carnot, decided victory at this eastern end of the line. 6 times the passage of the Sambre had failed. Reinforcements continued to reach the army, and the 7th attempt succeeded. Charleroi, which is the main fortress blocking the passage of the Sambre at this place, could be and was invested when once the river was crossed by the French. It capitulated in a week, but the evacuation of Charleroi was but just accomplished when Coburg, 70,000 strong, appeared in relief of the city. The plateau above the town where the great struggle was decided is known as that of Fleurus, and it was upon the 26th of June that the armies were there engaged. Never before had forces so equal permitted the French any success. It had hitherto been the ceaseless requisitioning of men to supply their insufficient training and command which had accomplished the salvation of the country. At Fleurus, though, there was still some advantage on the French side. The numbers were more nearly equal. The action was not determined for 10 hours, and on the French centre and left was nearly lost, when the reserves and Marceau's obstinacy in front of Fleurus village itself at last decided it. The consequences of the victory were final. As the French right advanced from Fleurus, the French left advanced from Ypres, and the centre became untenable for the Allies. The 4 French fortresses which the enemy still garrisoned in that Belgian belt of which I have spoken were invested and recaptured. By the 10th of July the French were in Brussels, the English were beaten back upon Holland, the Austrians retreating upon the Rhine, and the continuous success of the revolutionary armies was assured. While these things were proceeding upon land, however, there had appeared a factor in the war which modern desire for comfort and above all for commercial security has greatly exaggerated, but which the student will do well to note in its due proportion. This factor was the military weakness of France at sea. In mere numbers the struggle was entered upon with fleets in the ratio of about 2 to 1, while to the fleet of Great Britain, already twice as large as its opponent, must be added the fleets of the Allies. But numbers did not then, nor will they in the future, really decide the issue of maritime war. It was the supremacy of English gunnery which turned the scale. This triumphant superiority was proved in the battle of the 1st of June, 1794. The English fleet under Lord Howe attacked the French fleet, which was waiting to escort a convoy of grain into Brest. The forces came in contact upon the 28th of May, and the action was a running one of 3 days. 2 examples must suffice to prove how determining was the superiority of the British fire. The Queen Charlotte in the final action found herself caught between the Montaigne and the Jacobin. We have the figures of the losses during the duel of these 2 flagships. The Queen Charlotte lost 42 men in the short and furious exchange, the Montaigne alone 300. Again, consider the total figures. The number of the crews on both sides was nearly equal, but their losses were as 11 to 5. It cannot be too often repeated that the initial advantage which the English fleet gained in the Great War, which it maintained and increased as that war proceeded, and which it made absolute at Trafalgar, was an advantage mainly due to the guns. The reader must not expect in a sketch which ends with the fall of Robespierre any treatise, however short, upon the effect of sea power in the revolutionary wars. It has of late years been grossly exaggerated. The reaction which will follow this exaggeration may as grossly belittle it. It prevented the invasion of England. It permitted the exasperation and wearing out of the French forces in the peninsula. But it could not have determined the fate of Napoleon. That was determined by his Russian miscalculation and by his subsequent and consequent defeat at Leipzig. Upon the early success of the Revolution and the resulting establishment of European democracy, with which alone these pages deal, sea power was of no considerable effect. The end of section 30. The end of chapter 5. Section 31, The French Revolution. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The French Revolution by Hilaire Belloc. Section 31, Chapter 6, The Revolution and the Catholic Church. The last and most important of the aspects which the French Revolution presents to a foreign, and in particular to an English reader, is the antagonism which arose between it and the Church. As this is the most important, so it is the most practical of the historical problems which the Revolution sets the student to solve. For the opposition of the Church's organization in France has at once been the most profound which the Revolution has had to encounter, the most active in its methods, and the only one which has increased in strength as time proceeded. It is hardly too much to say that the Revolution would, in France at least, have achieved its object and created a homogeneous, centralized democracy, had not this great quarrel between the Republic and the Church arisen. And one may legitimately contrast the ready pliancy of men to political suggestion, and the easy story of their institutions where men knew nothing of the Church, with the great storms that arise and the fundamental quarrels that are challenged whenever men are acquainted with the burning truths of Catholicism. Finally, the struggle between the Catholic Church and the Revolution is not only the most important and the most practical, but also, by an unhappy coincidence, the most difficult of comprehension of all the matters presented to us by the great change. We have seen in this book that one department of revolutionary history, the second in importance, perhaps to the religious department, was also difficult of comprehension, to wit, the military department. And we have seen, or at least I have postulated, that the difficulty of following the military fortunes of the Republic was due to the mass of detail, to the technical character of the information to be acquired, and to the natural unfamiliarity of the general reader with the elements of military science. In other words, an accurate knowledge of great numbers of facts, the proper disposition of these facts in their order of military importance, and the correlation of a great number of disconnected actions and plans, will alone permit us to grasp the function of the armies in the development and establishment of the modern state through the revolutionary wars. Now, in this second and greater problem, the problem of the function played by religion, it is an exactly opposite method which can alone be of service. We must examine the field generally, and still more generally we must forget details that here only bewilder, and see in the largest possible outline what forces were really at issue, why their conflict occurred, upon what points that conflict was vital. Any more particular plan will land us, as it has landed so many thousands of controversialists, in mere invective on one side or the other, till we come to see nothing but a welter of treason on the part of priests and of massacre on the part of democrats. Men would, did they try to unravel the skein by analyzing the documents of the Vatican or of French archives, come apparently upon nothing but a host of petty, base, and often personal calculations. Or again, did they attempt to take a local sample of the struggle and to follow it in one department of thought, they would come upon nothing but a whirl of conflict with no sort of clue to the motives that lay behind. The contrast between the military and the religious problem of the French Revolution is like the contrast between the geological composition and the topographical contours of a countryside. To understand the first we must bore and dig. We must take numerous samples of soil and subject them to analysis. We must make ourselves acquainted with detail in its utmost recesses. But for the second, the more general our standpoint, the wider our gaze, and the more comprehensive our judgment, the more accurately do we grasp the knowledge we have set out to seek. We must then approach our business by asking at the outset the most general question of all. Was there a necessary and fundamental quarrel between the doctrines of the Revolution and those of the Catholic Church? Those ill-acquainted with either party, and therefore ill-equipped for reply, commonly reply with assurance in the affirmative. The French, and still more the non-French, Republican, who may happen by the accident of his life to have missed the Catholic Church, to have had no intimacy with any Catholic character, no reading of Catholic philosophy, and perhaps even no chance view of so much as an external Catholic ceremony, replies unhesitatingly that the Church is the necessary enemy of the Revolution. Again, the émigré, the wealthy woman, the recluse, any one of the many contemporary types to whom the democratic theory of the Revolution came as a complete novelty, and today the wealthy families in that tradition reply as unhesitatingly that the Revolution is the necessary enemy of the Church. The reply seems quite sufficient to the Tory squire in England or Germany, who may happen to be a Catholic by birth or by conversion, and it seems equally obvious to, let us say, a democratic member of some Protestant church in one of the new countries. Historically and logically, theologically also, those who affirm a necessary antagonism between the Republic and the Church are in error. Those who are best fitted to approach the problem by their knowledge both of what the Revolution attempted and of what Catholic philosophy is, find it in proportion to their knowledge difficult or impossible to answer that fundamental question in the affirmative. They cannot call the Revolution a necessary enemy of the Church, nor the Church of democracy. What is more, minds at once of the most active and of the best instructed sort are the very minds which find it difficult to explain how any such quarrel can have arisen. French history itself is full of the names of those for whom not so much a reconciliation between the Revolution and the Church as a statement that no real quarrel existed between them was the motive of politics, and almost in proportion to a man's knowledge of his fellows in Catholic societies, almost in that proportion is the prime question I have asked answered by such a man in the negative. A man who knows both the faith and the Republic will tell you that there is not and cannot be any necessary or fundamental reason why conflict should have arisen between a European democracy and a Catholic Church. When we examine those who concern themselves with the deepest and most abstract side of the quarrel, we find the same thing. It is impossible for the theologian, or even for the practical ecclesiastical teacher, to put his finger upon a political doctrine essential to the Revolution and say, this doctrine is opposed to Catholic dogma or to Catholic morals. Conversely, it is impossible for the Republican to put his finger upon a matter of ecclesiastical discipline or religious dogma and to say, this Catholic point is at issue with my political theory of the state. Thousands of active men upon either side would have been only too willing during the last 100 years to discover some such issue, and it is proved undiscoverable. In a word, only those Democrats who know little of the Catholic Church can say that of its nature it forbids democracy, and only those Catholics who have a confused or imperfect conception of democracy can say that of its nature it is antagonistic to the Catholic Church. Much that is taught by the purely temporal theory of the one is indifferent to the transcendental and supernatural philosophy of the other. In some points where there is contact, as in the conception of the dignity of man and of the equality of men, there is agreement. To sum up, the Republican cannot by his theory persecute the Church. The Church cannot by her theory excommunicate the Republican. Why then, it must be asked, has there in practice arisen so furious and so enormous a conflict whose activity and whose consequences are not narrowing but broadening today? It may be replied to this second question, which is only less general than the first, in one of two manners. One may say that the actions of men are divided, not by theories, but by spiritual atmosphere, as it were. According to this view, men act under impulses not ideal but actual, impulses which affect great numbers and yet in their texture correspond to the complex but united impulses of an individual personality. Thus, though there be no conflict demonstrable between the theology of the Catholic Church and the political theory of the Revolution, yet there may be necessary and fundamental conflict between the persons we call the Revolution and the Church, and between the vivifying principles by which either lives. This is one answer that can and is given. Or one may give a totally different answer and say, there was no quarrel between the theology of the Catholic Church and the political theory of the Revolution, but the folly of this statesman, the ill drafting of that law, the misconception of such and such an institution, the coincidence of war breaking out at such and such a moment and affecting men in such and such a fashion. All these material accidents bred a misunderstanding between the two great forces, led into conflict the human officers and the human organizations which directed them, and conflict, once established, feeds upon and grows from its own substance. The end of section 31. Section 32, The French Revolution. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The French Revolution by Hilaire Belloc. Section 32, Chapter 6, continued, The Revolution and the Catholic Church. Now, if that first form of reply be given to the question we have posed, though it is sufficient for the type of philosophy which uses it, though it is certainly explanatory of all human quarrels, and though it in particular satisfies a particular modern school of thought, it is evident that history, properly so called, cannot deal with it. You may say that the Revolution was the expression of a spirit far more real than any theory, that this spirit is no more susceptible of analysis or definition than is the personality of a single human character, and that this reality was in conflict with another reality, to wit, the Catholic Church. You may even, as some minds, by no means negligible, have done, pass to the field of mysticism in the matter, and assert that really personal forces, wills superior and external to man, demons and angels, drove the Revolution against the Catholic Church and created the Republic to be an anti-Catholic force capable of meeting and of defeating that Church which, by its own definition of itself, is not a theory, but the expression of a personality and a will. To put it in old-fashioned terms, you may say that the Revolution was the work of Antichrist. But with that kind of reply, I repeat, history cannot deal. If it be true that, in spite of an absence of contradictory intellectual theories, there is a fundamental spiritual contradiction between the Revolution and the Catholic Church, then time will test the business. We shall see in the case a perpetual extension of the quarrel until the Revolution becomes principally a force for the extinction of Catholicism, and the Catholic Church appears to the supporter of the Revolution not as his principal but as his only enemy. Such a development has not arisen in 100 years. A process of time far more lengthy will alone permit us to judge whether the supposed duello is a real matter or a phantasm. The second type of answer, the answer which pretends to explain the antagonism by a definite series of events, does concern the historian. Proceeding upon the lines of that second answer, he can bring his science to bear and use the instruments of his trade, and he can show, as I propose to show in what follows, how, although no quarrel can be found between the theory of the Revolution and that of the Church, an active quarrel did in fact spring up between the Revolution in action and the authorities of Catholicism, a quarrel which 100 years has not appeased but accentuated. Behind the revolutionary quarrel lay the condition of the Church in the French state since the settlement of the quarrel of the Reformation. With what that quarrel of the Reformation was, the reader is sufficiently familiar. For, roughly speaking, 100 years, from the first years of the 16th century to the first years of the 17th, from the youth of Henry VIII to the boyhood of Charles I in England, a great attempt was made to change, as one party would have said to amend, as the other would have said to denaturalize, the whole body of Western Christendom. A general movement of attack upon the inherited form of the Church, and a general resistance to that attack, was at work throughout European civilization, and either antagonist hoped for a universal success, the one of what he called the Reformation of religion, the other of what he called the divine institution and visible unity of the Catholic Church. At the end of such a period it became apparent that no such general result had been or could be obtained. All that part of the West which had rejected the authority of the See of Rome began to appear as a separate territorial region, permanently divided from the rest. All that part of Europe which had retained the authority of the See of Rome began to appear as another region of territory. The line of cleavage between the two was beginning to define itself as a geographical line, and nearly corresponded to the line which centuries before had divided the Roman and civilized world from the barbarians. The province of Britain had an exceptional fate. Though Roman in origin and of the ancient civilization in its foundation, it fell upon the non-Roman side of the new boundary, while Ireland, which the Roman Empire had never organized or instructed, remained alone with the external parts of Europe in communion with Rome. Italy, Spain, and in the main southern or Romanized Germany refused ultimately to abandon their tradition of civilization and of religion. But in Gaul it was otherwise, and the action of Gaul during the Reformation must be seized if its modern religious quarrels are to be apprehended. A very considerable portion of the French landed and mercantile classes, that is, of the wealthy men of the country, were in sympathy with the new religious doctrines and the new social organization which had now taken root in England, Scotland, Holland, northern Germany and Scandinavia, and which were destined in those countries to lead to the domination of wealth. These French squires and traders were called the Huguenots. The succeeding 100 years, from 1615 to 1715, let us say, were a settlement, not without bloodshed, of the unsatisfied quarrel of the preceding century. All Englishmen know what happened in England, how the last vestiges of Catholicism were crushed out, and all the social and political consequences of Protestantism established in the state. There was even in that same 17th century a separate but futile attempt to destroy Catholicism in Ireland. In Germany a struggle of the utmost violence had only led to a similar regional result. The first third of that 100 years concluded in the Peace of Westphalia, and left the Protestant and Catholic territorial divisions much what we now know them. In France, however, the peculiar phenomena remained of a body powerful in numbers and, what was far more important, in wealth and social power, scattered throughout the territory of the kingdom, organized and by this time fixedly anti-Catholic and therefore anti-national. The nation had recovered its traditional line and had insisted upon the victory of a strong executive, and that executive Catholic. France, therefore, in this period of settlement, became an absolute monarchy whose chief possessed tremendous and immediate powers, and a monarchy which incorporated with itself all the great elements of the national traditions, including the Church. It is the name of Louis XIV, of course, which symbolizes this great time. His very long reign precisely corresponds to it. He was born coincidentally with that universal struggle for a religious settlement in Europe which I have described as characteristic of the time. He died precisely at its close, and under him it seemed as though the reconstructed power of Gaul and the defense of organized Catholicism were to be synonymous. But there were two elements of disruption in that homogeneous body which Louis XIV apparently commanded. The very fact that the Church had thus become in France an unshakable national institution chilled the vital source of Catholicism. Not only did the hierarchy stand in perpetual suspicion of the Roman See, and toy with the conception of national independence, but they and all the official organization of French Catholicism put the security of the national establishment and its intimate attachment to the general political structure of the state far beyond the sanctity of Catholic dogma or the practice of Catholic morals. That political structure, the French monarchy, seemed to be of granite and eternal. Had it indeed survived, the Church in Gaul would be doubtless, in spite of its attachment to so mundane a thing as the crown, have still survived to enjoy one of those resurrections which have never failed it in the past, and would have returned by some creative reaction to its principle of life. But for the moment the consequence of this fixed political establishment was that scepticism and all those other active forces of the mind which play upon religion in any Catholic state had full opportunity. The Church was, so to speak, not concerned to defend itself, but only its method of existence. It was as though a garrison, forgetting the main defences of a place, had concentrated all its effort upon the security of one work which contained its supplies of food. Wit, good verse, sincere enthusiasm, a lucid exposition of whatever in the human mind perpetually rebels against transcendental affirmations, were allowed every latitude and provoked no effective reply. But overt acts of disrespect to ecclesiastical authority were punished with rigor. The end of section 32. Section 33. The French Revolution. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The French Revolution by Hilaire Belloc. Section 33, Chapter 6 continued, The Revolution and the Catholic Church. While in the wealthy, the bureaucratic and the governing classes, to ridicule the faith was an attitude taken for granted. Seriously to attack the privileges or position of its ministers was ungentlemanly and was not allowed. It did not shock the hierarchy that one of its apostolic members should be a witty atheist, that another should go hunting upon Corpus Christi, nearly upset the Blessed Sacrament in his gallop, and forget what day it was when the accident occurred. The bishops found nothing remarkable in seeing a large proportion of their body to be loose livers, or in some of them openly presenting their friends to their mistresses, as might be done by any great lay noble round them. That a diocese or any other spiritual charge should be divorced from its titular chief seemed to them as natural as does to us the absence from his modern regiment of some titular foreign colonel. Unquestioned also by the bishops were the poverty, the neglect, and the uninstruction of the parish clergy. Nay, and this is by far the principal feature, the abandonment of religion by all but a very few of the French millions, no more affected the ecclesiastical officials of the time than does the starvation of our poor affect, let us say, one of our professional politicians. It was a thing simply taken for granted. The reader must seize that moribund condition of the religious life of France upon the eve of the Revolution, for it is at once imperfectly grasped by the general run of historians, and is also the only fact which thoroughly explains what followed. The swoon of the faith in the 18th century is the negative foundation upon which the strange religious experience of the French was about to rise. France, in the generation before the Revolution, was passing through a phase in which the Catholic faith was at a lower ebb than it had ever been since the preaching and establishment of it in Gaul. This truth is veiled by more than one circumstance. Thus many official acts, notably marriages and the registration of births, took place under a Catholic form, and indeed Catholic forms had a monopoly of them. Again, the state wore Catholic clothes, as it were. The public occasions of pomp were full of religious ceremony. Few of the middle classes went to Mass in the great towns, hardly any of the artisans, but the churches were official. Great sums of money, including official money, were at the disposal of the Church, and the great ecclesiastics were men from whom solid favours could be got. Again, the historic truth is masked by the language and point of view of the great Catholic reaction which has taken place in our own time. It is safe to say that where one adult of the educated classes concerned himself seriously with the Catholic faith and practice in France before the Revolution, there are 5 today. But in between lies the violent episode of the persecution, and the Catholic reaction in our time perpetually tends to contrast a supposed pre-revolutionary Catholic society with the revolutionary fury. Look, say its champions, at the dreadful way in which the Revolution treated the Church. And as they say this, the converse truth appears obvious, and they seem to imply, think how different it must have been before the Revolution persecuted the Church. The very violence of the modern reaction towards Catholicism has exaggerated the revolutionary persecution, and in doing so has made men forget that, apart from other evidence of the decline of religion, it is obvious that persecution could never have arisen without a strong and continuous historical backing. You could not have had a Diocletian in the 13th century with the spirit of the Crusaders just preceding him. You could not have had a Henry VIII if the England of the 15th century just preceding him had been an England devoted to the monastic profession. And you could not have had the revolutionary fury against the Catholic Church in France if the preceding generation had been actively Catholic, even in a considerable portion. As a fact, of course, it was not. And in the popular indifference to or hatred of the Church, the principal factor was the strict brotherhood, not so much of Church and State as of Church and executive government. But there was another factor. We were describing a little way back how in France there had arisen during the movement of the Reformation a wealthy, powerful, and numerically large Huguenot body. In mere numbers it dwindled, but it maintained throughout the 17th century a very high position, both of privilege and, what was its characteristic, of money power. And even today, though their birth rate is of course lower than the average of the nation, the French Huguenots number close upon 1 million, and are far wealthier upon the average than their fellow citizens. It is their wealth which dominates the trade of certain districts, which exercises so great an effect upon the universities, the publishing trade, and the press, and in general lends them such weight in the affairs of the nation. Now the Huguenot had in France a special and permanent quarrel with the monarchy, and therefore with the Catholic Church, which, precisely because it was not of the vivid and intense kind which is associated with popular and universal religions, was the more secretly ubiquitous. His quarrel was that, having been highly privileged for nearly a century, the member of a state within a state, and for more than a generation free to hold assemblies separate from and often antagonistic to the national government, these privileges had been suddenly removed from him by the government of Louis XIV, a century before the Revolution. The quarrel was more political than religious. It was a sort of home rule quarrel. For though the Huguenots were spread throughout France, they had possessed special cities and territories wherein their spirit, and to a certain extent their private self-government, formed enclaves of particularism within the state. They had held this position, as I have said, for close upon 100 years. And it was not until a date contemporary with the violent settlement of the religious trouble in England by the expulsion of James II that a similar settlement, less violent, achieved, as it was thought, a similar religious unity in France. But that unity was not achieved. The Huguenots, though no longer permitted to exist as a state within a state, remained for the 100 years between the revocation of the Edict of Nantes and the outbreak of the Revolution a powerful and ever watchful body. They stood upon the flank of the attack which intellectual skepticism was making upon the Catholic Church, and they were prepared to take advantage of that skepticism's first political victory. And since the Revolution they have been the most powerful, and after the Freemasons, with whom they are largely identified, the most strongly organized of the anti-clerical forces in the country. The Jews, whose action since the Revolution has been so remarkable in this same business, were not, in the period immediately preceding it, of any considerable influence, and their element in the coalition may be neglected. Such then was the position when the Revolution was preparing. Within memory of all men living, the Church had become more and more official. The masses of the great towns had wholly lost touch with it. The intelligence of the country was in the main drawn to the deist or even to the purely sceptical propaganda. The powerful Huguenot body was ready prepared for an alliance with any foe of Catholicism, and in the eyes of the impoverished town populace, notably in Paris, which had long abandoned the practice of religion, the human organization of the Church, the hierarchy, the priesthood, and the few but very wealthy religious orders which still lingered on in dwindling numbers, were but a portion of the privileged world which the populace hated and was prepared to destroy. It is upon such a spirit and in such conditions of the national religious life that the Revolution begins to work. In the National Assembly you have the great body of the Commons which determines the whole, touched only here and there with men in any way acquainted with or devoted to Catholic practice, and those men for the most part individual and eccentric, that is, un-Catholic, almost in proportion to the genuineness of their religious feeling. Among the nobility the practice of religion was a social habit with some; as a mental attitude the faith was forgotten among all but very few. Among the clergy, a very wealthy hierarchy, no one of them prepared to defend the Church with philosophical argument, and almost unanimous in regarding itself as a part of the old political machine, was dominant, while the representatives of the lower clergy, strongly democratic in character, were at first more occupied with the establishment of democracy than with the impending attack upon the material and temporal organization of the Church. The end of section 33. Section 34. The French Revolution. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The French Revolution by Hilaire Belloc. Section 34. Chapter 6 continued. The Revolution and the Catholic Church. Now that material and temporal organization offered at the very beginning of the debates an opportunity for attack which no other department of the old regime could show. The immediate peril of the state was financial. The pretext, and even to some extent the motive for the calling of the States General, was the necessity for finding money. The old fiscal machinery had broken down, and, as always happens when a fiscal machine breaks down, the hardship it involved and the pressure upon individuals which it involved appeared to be universal. There was no immediate and easily available fund of wealth upon which the executive could lay hands save the wealth of the clergy. Feudal dues of the nobles, if abandoned, must fall rather to the peasantry than to the state. Of the existing taxes, few could be increased without peril, and none with any prospect of a large additional revenue. The charge for debt alone was one half of the total receipts of the state. The deficit was in proportion to the revenue overwhelming. Face to face with that you had an institution not popular, one whose public functions were followed by but a small proportion of the population, one in which income was most unequally distributed, and one whose feudal property yielded in dues an amount equal to more than a quarter of the total revenue of the state. Add to this a system of tithes which produced nearly as much again, and it will be apparent under what a financial temptation the Assembly lay. It may be argued, of course, that the right of the Church to this ecclesiastical property, whether in land or in titles, was absolute. and that the confiscation of the one or of the other form of revenue was mere theft. But such was not the legal conception of the moment. The wealth of the Church was not even, and this is most remarkable, defended as absolute property by the generality of those who enjoyed it. The tone of the debates which suppressed the tithes, and later confiscated the Church lands, was a tone of discussion upon legal points, precedents, public utility, and so forth. There was not heard in it, in any effective degree, the assertion of mere moral right, though in that time the moral rights of property were among the first of political doctrines. It was not, however, the confiscation of the Church lands and the suppression of the tithe which founded the quarrel between the Revolution and the clergy. No financial or economic change is ever more than a preparation for, or a permissive condition of, a moral change. It is never the cause of the moral change. Even the suppression of the religious houses in the beginning of 1790 must not be taken as the point of departure in the great quarrel. The religious orders in France were at that moment too decayed in zeal and in numbers, too wealthy and much too removed from the life of the nation, for this to be the case. The true historical point of departure from which we must date the beginning of this profound debate between the Revolution and Catholicism is to be found in the morning of the 30th of May 1790, when a parliamentary committee, the Ecclesiastical Committee, presented to the House its plan for the reform of the constitution of the Church in Gaul. The enormity of that act is now apparent to the whole world. The proposal at the bidding of chance representatives, not elected ad hoc, to change the dioceses and the sees of Catholic France, the decision of an ephemeral political body to limit to such and such tithes, and very feeble they were, the bond between the Church of France and the Holy See, the suppression of the cathedral chapters, the seemingly farcical proposal that bishops should be elected, nay, priests also thus chosen, the submission of the hierarchy in the matter of the residence and travel to a civil authority which openly declared itself indifferent in matters of religion. All this bewilders the modern mind. How, we ask, could men so learned, so enthusiastic, so laborious, and so closely in touch with all the realities of their time, make a blunder of that magnitude? Much more, how did such a blunder escape the damnation of universal mockery and immediate impotence? The answer is to be discovered in what has just been laid down with so much insistence: the temporary eclipse of religion in France before the Revolution broke out. The men who framed the constitution of the clergy, the men who voted for it, nay, even the men who argued against it, all had at the back of their minds three conceptions which they were attempting to reconcile. Of those three conceptions, one was wholly wrong, one was imperfect because superficial, and the third alone was true. And these three conceptions were, first, that the Catholic Church was a moribund superstition; secondly, that it possessed in its organization and traditions a power to be reckoned with; and thirdly, that the State, its organs and their corporate inheritance of action, were so bound up with the Catholic Church that it was impossible to effect any general political settlement in which that body, both external to France and internal, should be neglected. Of these three conceptions, had the first been as true as the last, it would have saved the constitution of the clergy and the reputation for common sense of those who framed it. It was certainly true that Catholicism had for so many centuries been bound up in the framework of the State, that the Parliament must therefore do something with the Church in the general settlement of the nation. It could not merely leave the Church on one side. It was also superficially true that the Church was a power to be reckoned with politically, quite apart from the traditional union of Church and State, but only superficially true. What the revolutionary politicians feared was the intrigue of those who commanded the organization of the Catholic Church, men whom they knew for the most part to be without religion, and the sincerity of all of whom they naturally doubted. A less superficial and more solid judgment of the matter would have discovered that the real danger lay in the animosity or intrigue against the civil constitution, not of the corrupt hierarchy, but of the sincere though ill-instructed and dwindling minority which was still loyally attached to the doctrines and discipline of the Church. But even this superficial judgment would not have been fatal had not the judgment of the National Assembly been actually erroneous upon the first point, the vitality of the faith. Had the Catholic Church been, as nearly all educated men then imagined, a moribund superstition, had the phase of decline through which it was passing been a phase comparable to that through which other religions have passed in their last moments, had it been supported by ancient families from mere tradition, clung to by remote peasants from mere ignorance and isolation, abandoned as it was in towns simply because the towns had better opportunities of intellectual enlightenment and of acquiring elementary knowledge in history and the sciences, had, in a word, the imaginary picture which these men drew in their minds of the Catholic Church and its fortunes been an exact one, then the civil constitution of the clergy would have been a statesmanlike act. It would have permitted the hold of the Catholic Church upon such districts as it still retained to vanish slowly and without shock. It proposed to keep alive at a reasonable salary the ministers of a ritual which would presumably have lost all vitality before the last of its pensioners was dead. It would have prepared a bed, as it were, upon which the last of Catholicism in Gaul could peacefully pass away. The action of the politicians in framing the Constitution would have seemed more generous with every passing decade, and their wisdom in avoiding offence to the few who still remained faithful would have been increasingly applauded. On the other hand, and from the point of view of the statesman, the civil constitution of the clergy, bound strictly to the State and made responsible to it those ancient functions not yet dead of the episcopacy and all its train. It was a wise and a just consideration on the part of the Assembly that religions retain their machinery long after they are dead, and if that machinery has ever been a State machinery, it must remain subject to the control of the State, and subject not only up to the moment when the living force which once animated it has fled, but much longer, up indeed to the moment when the surviving institutions of the dead religion break down and perish. So argued the National Assembly and its Committee, and I repeat, the argument was just and statesmanlike, prudent and full of foresight, save for one miscalculation. The Catholic Church was not dead, and it was not even dying. It was exhibiting many of the symptoms which in other organisms and institutions correspond to the approach of death, but the Catholic Church is an organism and an institution quite unlike any other. It fructifies and expands immediately under the touch of a lethal weapon. It has at its very roots the conception that material prosperity is stifling to it, poverty and misfortune nutritious. The end of section 34. Section 35. The French Revolution. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The French Revolution by Hilaire Belloc. Section 35, Chapter 6, continued. The Revolution and the Catholic Church. The men of the National Assembly would have acted more wisely had they closely studied the story of Ireland, then but little known, or had they even made themselves acquainted with the methods by which the Catholic Church in Britain, after passing in the 15th century through a phase somewhat similar to that under which it was sinking into Gaul in the 18th, was still under Henry and Elizabeth. But the desire of the men of 1789 was not to kill the Church, but to let it die. They thought it dying. Their desire was only to make that death decent and of no hurt to the nation, and to control the political action of a hierarchy that had been wealthy and was bound up with the old society that was crumbling upon every side. The civil constitution of the clergy failed. It lit the Civil War. It dug the pit which divided Catholicism from the Revolution at the moment of the foreign invasion. It segregated the loyal priest in such a fashion that his order could not but appear to the populace as an order of traitors, and it led in the furnace of 1793 to the great persecution from the memories of which the relations between the French democracy and the Church have not recovered. It is important to trace the actual steps of the failure, for when we appreciate what the dates were, how short the time which was left for judgment or for revision, and how immediately disaster followed upon error, we can understand what followed, and we can understand it in no other way. If we find an enduring quarrel between two families whose cause of contention we cannot seize, and whose mutual hostility we find unreasonable, to learn that it proceeded from a cataclysm too rapid and too violent for either to have exercised judgment upon it, will enable us to excuse, or at least to comprehend, the endurances of their antagonism. Now it was a cataclysm which fell upon the relations of the Church and the State immediately after the error which the Parliament had committed, a cataclysm quite out of proportion to their intentions, as indeed are most sudden disasters quite out of proportion to the forces that bring them about. It was, as we have seen, in the summer of 1790, upon the 12th of July, that the civil constitution of the clergy was approved by the Assembly. But it was not until the 26th of August that the King consented to sign, nor was there at the moment any attempt to give the law effect. The protests of the bishops, for instance, came out quite at leisure in the month of October, and the active principle of the whole of the civil constitution, to wit, the presentation of the civic oath which the clergy were required to take, was not even debated until the end of the year. This civic oath, which is sometimes used as the bugbear in the matter, was no more than an engagement under the sanction of an oath that the bishop or priest taking it would maintain the new regime, though that regime included the constitution of the clergy. The oath involved no direct breach with Catholic doctrine or practice. It was indeed a folly to impose it, and it was folly based upon the ignorance of the politicians and of many of the bishops of the day as to the nature of the Catholic Church. But the oath was not, nor was it intended to be, a measure of persecution. Many of the parish clergy took it, and most of them probably took it in good faith. Nor did it discredit the oath with the public that was refused by all save 4 of the acting bishops, for the condition of the hierarchy in pre-revolutionary France was notorious. The action of the bishops appeared in the public eye to be purely political, and the ready acceptance of the oath by so many, though a minority of the lower clergy, argued strongly in its favour. Nevertheless, no Catholic priest or bishop or layman could take that oath without landing himself in disloyalty to his religion, and that for the same reason which led St. Thomas of Canterbury to make his curious and fruitful stand against the reasonable and inevitable, as much as against the unreasonable governmental provisions of his time. The Catholic Church is an institution of necessity autonomous. It cannot admit the right of any other power exterior to its own organization to impose upon it a modification of its discipline, nor, above all, a new conception of its hierarchic organization. The reader must carefully distinguish between the acceptation by the Church of a detail of economic reform, the consent to suppress a corporation at the request of a civil power, or even to forego certain traditional political rights, and the admission of the general principle of civil control. To that general principle the Assembly, in framing the constitution of the clergy, was quite evidently committed. To admit such a coordinated external and civic power, or rather to admit a superior external power, is in theory to deny the principle of Catholicism, and in practice to make of the Catholic Church what the other state religions of Christendom have become. I have said that not until the end of the year 1790 was a debate opened upon the proposition to compel the clergy to take the oath. It is a singular commentary upon the whole affair that compulsion should have been the subject for debate at all. It should have followed, one would have imagined normally, from the law. But so exceptional had been the action of the Assembly, and, as they were now beginning to find, so perilous, that a special decree was necessary, and the King's signature to it, before this normal consequence of a measure which had been law for months could be acted upon. Here let the reader pause and consider with what that moment, the end of 1790, coincided. The assignats, paper money, issued upon the security of the confiscated estates of the Church, had already depreciated 10%. Those who had first accepted them were paying throughout France a penny in the livre, or, as we may put it, a penny farthing on the shilling, for what must have seemed to most of them the obstinacy of one single corporation, and that an unpopular one, against the decrees of the National Assembly. It was now the moment when a definite reaction against the Revolution was first taking shape, and when the populace was first beginning uneasily to have suspicion of it. It was the moment when the court was beginning to negotiate for flight. It was the moment when, though the populace did not know it, Mirabeau was advising the King with all his might to seize upon the enforcement of the priest's oath as an opportunity for civil war. The whole air of that winter was charged with doubt and mystery in the minds of all who had enthusiastically followed the march of the Revolution. The short days of that rigorous cold of 1790 91 contained passages of despair, and a very brief period was to suffice for making the clerical oath not only the test of democracy against reaction, but the wedge that should split the nation in two. With the very opening of the new year, on the 4th of January, the bishops and priests in the Assembly were summoned to take the oath to the King, the nation, and the law. But that law included the civil constitution of the clergy, and they refused. Within 3 months Mirabeau was dead, the flight of the King determined on, the suspicion of Paris at white heat, the oath taken or refused throughout France, and the schismatic priests introduced into their parishes. It may be imagined with what a clamour and with how many village quarrels. In that same fortnight appeared the papal brief, long delayed, and known as the brief Caritas, denouncing the civil constitution of the clergy. 6 weeks later, at the end of May, the papal representative at the French court was withdrawn, and in that act religious war declared. Throughout this quarrel, which was now exactly of a year's duration, but the acute phase of which had lasted only 6 months, every act of either party to it necessarily tended to make the conflict more violent. Not only was there no opportunity for conciliation, but in the very nature of things the most moderate counsel had to range itself on one side or the other, and every public act which touched in any way upon the sore point, though it touched but indirectly, and with no desire on the part of the actors to rouse the passions of the moment, immediately appeared as a provocation upon one side or the other. It was inevitable that it should be so. With a population which had abandoned the practice of religion, with the attachment of the clerical organization to the organization of the old regime, with the strict bond of discipline that united the priesthood of the Church in France into one whole, and above all with the necessity under which the Revolution was at this stage of finding a definite and tangible enemy. This last point is of the very first importance. Public opinion was exasperated and inflamed, for the King was known to be an opponent of the democratic movement. Yet he signed the bills and could not be overtly attacked. The Queen was known to be a violent opponent of it, but she did not actually govern. The governments of Europe were known to be opponents, but no diplomatic note had yet appeared of which public opinion could make an object for an attack. The resistance, therefore, offered by the clergy to the civil constitution had just that effect which a nucleus will have in the crystallization of some solution. It polarized the energies of the Revolution. It provided a definite foil, a definite negative, a definite counterpoint, a definite butt. Here was a simple issue. Men wearing a special uniform, pursuing known functions, performing a known part in society, to wit, the priests, were now for the most part the enemies of the new democratic constitution that was in preparation. They would not take the oath of loyalty to it. They were everywhere in secret rebellion against it, and where they were dispossessed of their cures, in open rebellion. The clergy, therefore, that is, the non-juring clergy, and the conforming clergy were an experiment that soon became a fiction, were after April 1791, in the eyes of all the democrats of the time, the plainest and most tangible form of the opposition to democracy. The end of section 35. Section 36. The French Revolution. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The French Revolution by Hilaire Belloc. Section 36. Chapter 6 concluded. The French Revolution and the Catholic Church. To the way in which I have presented the problem, a great deal more might be added. The very fact that the democratic movement had come after a period of unfaith and was non-Catholic in its springs would have tended to produce that quarrel. So would the necessary attachment of the Catholic to authority and the easy confusion between the principle of authority and claims of a traditional monarchy. Again, the elements of vanity, of material greed, and of a false finality which are to be discovered in any purely democratic theory of the state, will between them always bring this theory into some conflict with religion. The centuries during which the throne and the altar had stood as twin symbols, especially in France, the very terminology of religious metaphor which had been forged during the centuries of monarchical institutions in Europe, helped to found the great quarrel. But, I repeat, the overt act without which the quarrel could never have become the terribly great thing it did, the master blunder which destroyed the unity of the revolutionary movement, was the civil constitution of the clergy. So much for the first year of the schism, May 1790 to May 1791. The second year is but an intensification of the process apparent in the first. It opens with the King's flight in June 1791, that is, with the first open act of enmity taken against the authority of the National Parliament, since 2 years before the National Parliament had declared itself supreme. Already the court had been generally identified with the resistance of the clergy, and a particular example of this had appeared in the opinion that the King's attempted journey to St. Cloud in April had been prompted by a desire to have communion at the hands of a non-juring priest. Footnote. This opinion has entered into so many Protestant and non-Catholic histories of the Revolution that it is worth criticizing once again in this little book. The King was perfectly free to receive communion privately from the hands of Orthodox priests, did so receive it, and had received communion well within the canonical times. There was little ecclesiastical reason for the attempted leaving of Paris for St. Cloud on Monday the 18th April 1791, save the custom, not the religious duty, of communicating in public on Easter Sunday itself. It was a political move. When, therefore, the King fled, though his flight had nothing whatsoever to do with the clerical quarrel, it was associated in men's minds with the clerical quarrel through his attempt to leave Paris in April, and from a long association of the court with the clerical resistance. The outburst of anti-monarchical feeling which followed the flight was at the same time an outburst of anti-clerical feeling. But the clergy were everywhere and could be attacked everywhere. The declaration of Pillnitz, which the nation very rightly interpreted as the beginning of an armed European advance against the French democracy, was felt to be a threat not only in favour of the king, but in favour also of the rebellious ecclesiastics, and so forth. The uneasy approach of the war throughout that autumn and winter of 1791-92, the peculiar transformation of the French temperament which war or its approach invariably produces, a sort of constructive exaltation and creative passion, began to turn a great part of its energy or fury against the very persons of the orthodox priests. The new Parliament, the Legislative as it was called, had not been sitting 2 months when it passed upon November 29th, 1791, the decree that non-juring priests should be deprived of their stipend. And here again we must note the curious lack of adjustment between law and fact in all this clerical quarrel. For more than a year public money had been paid to men who, under the law, should not during the whole of that year have touched any salary. Yet, as in the case of the oath, special action was necessary, and moreover the Parliament added to this tardy and logical consequence of the law a declaration that those who had not so taken the oath within 8 days of their decree should be rendered suspect. The word suspect is significant. The Parliament even now could not act, at least it could not act without the king, and this word suspect, which carried no material consequences with it, was one that might cover a threat of things worse than regular and legal punishment. It was like the mark that some power not authorized or legal makes upon the door of those whom that power has singled out for massacre in some city. 3 weeks later Louis vetoed the decree refusing stipends to non-jurors, and the year 1791 ended with the whole matter in suspense, but with the exasperation increasing to madness. The first 3 months of 1792 saw no change. The non-juring clergy were still tolerated by the executive in their illegal position, and what is more extraordinary, still received public money and were still, for the most part, in possession of their cures. The conception that the clergy were the prime, or at any rate the most obvious enemies of the new regime, now hardened into a fixed opinion which the attempted persecution of religion, as the one party called it, the obstinate and anti-national rebellion of factious priests, as the other party called it, was rapidly approaching real persecution and real rebellion. With April 1792 came the war, and all the passions of the war. The known hostility of the king to the revolution was now become something far worse, his known sympathy with an enemy under arms. To force the king into the open was henceforward the main tactic of the revolutionary body. Now, for those whose object was forcing Louis XVI to open declaration of hostility against the nation, his religion was an obvious instrument. In no point could one come to closer grips with the king than on this question of the Church, where already in December 1791 he had exercised his veto. On May 27, 1792, therefore, Guadet and Vergniaud, the Girondins, moved that a priest who had refused to take the oath should be subjected to transportation upon the mere demand of any 20 taxpayers within that assembly of parishes known as a canton. It was almost exactly 2 years since the civil constitution of the clergy had first been reported to the House by the Ecclesiastical Committee of the Constituent or National Assembly. It must not be forgotten under what external conditions this violent act, the first true act of persecution, was demanded. It was already a month since, upon the 20th of April, the war had opened upon the Belgian frontier by a disgraceful panic and the murder of General Dillon. Almost contemporaneous with that breakdown was the corresponding panic and flight of the French troops in their advance to Mons. All Europe was talking of the facile march upon Paris, which could now be undertaken, and in general this decree against the priests was but part of the exasperated policy which was rising to meet the terror of the invasion. It was followed, of course, by the decree dismissing the Royal Guard, and rather more than a week later by the demand for the formation of a camp of volunteers under the walls of Paris. But with this we are not here concerned. The king vetoed the decree against the non-juring priests, and in the wild 2 months that followed, the Orthodox clergy were in the mind of the populace, and particularly the populace of Paris, identified with the cause of the re-establishment of the old regime and the success of the invading foreign armies. With the crash of the 10th of August the persecution began, the true persecution, which was to the growing bitterness of the previous 2 years what a blow is to the opening words of a quarrel. The decree of the 27th of May was put into force within 11 days of the fall of the Tuileries. True, it was not put into force in that crudity which the Parliament had demanded. The non-juring priests were given a fortnight to leave the kingdom, and if they failed to avail themselves of the delay were to be transported. From this date to the end of the Terror, 23 months later, the story of the relation between the Revolution and the Church, though wild and terrible, is simple. It is a story of mere persecution, culminating in extremes of cruelty and in the supposed uprooting of Christianity in France. The Orthodox clergy were everywhere regarded by this time as the typical enemies of the revolutionary movement. They themselves regarded the revolutionary movement by this time as being principally an attempt to destroy the Catholic Church. Within 7 months of the fall of the monarchy, from the 18th of March 1793, the priests, whether non-juring or schismatic, might, on the denunciation of any 6 citizens, be subjected to transportation. There followed immediately a general attack upon religion. The attempted closing of all churches was of course a failure, but it was firmly believed that such attachment as yet remained to the Catholic Church was due only to the ignorance of the provincial districts which displayed it, or to the self-seeking of those who fostered it. The attempt at mere de-Christianization, as it was called, failed, but the months of terror and cruelty, the vast number of martyrdoms, for they were no less, and the incredible sufferings and indignities to which the priests who attempted to remain in the country were subjected, burnt itself, as it were, into the very fibre of the Catholic organization in France, and remained, in spite of political theory one way or the other, and in spite of the national sympathies of the priesthood, the one great active memory inherited from that time. Conversely, the picture of the priest, his habit and character, as the fatal and necessary opponent of the revolutionary theory, became so fixed in the mind of the Republican that 2 generations did nothing to eliminate it, and that even in our time the older men, in spite of pure theory, cannot rid themselves of an imagined connection between the Catholic Church and an international conspiracy against democracy. Nor does this non-rational but very real feeling lack support from the utterances of those who, in opposing the political theory of the French Revolution, consistently quote the Catholic Church as its necessary and holy antagonist. The attempt to de-Christianize France failed, as I have said, completely. Public worship was restored, and the Concordat of Napoleon was believed to have settled the relations between Church and State in a permanent fashion. We have lived to see it dissolved, but this generation will not see, nor perhaps the generation succeeding it, the issue of the struggle between 2 bodies of thought which are divided by no process of reason, but profoundly divorced by the action of vivid and tragic historical memories. The end of section 36. The end of chapter 6. The end of the French Revolution.